Authority Without Family. 50 Years of Free Love. By Arend Heinlein. Anyone who still believes that the postmodern age in the style of educated bourgeois cultural apostles is superficial, cold, and lacking in authenticity must be suffering from a disturbed perception. On the contrary, a huge wave of sensitivity has been sweeping the Western world for years, which is increasingly proving to be an expression of a hardened false consciousness that rationalizes its own unresponsiveness as a very special form of openness and accessibility. A now historical but exemplary symptom of the emergence of this false responsiveness was the pop cultural enthusiasm for the so-called emos, who 10 or 12 years ago were admired as a soft version of the goths for their seductive but somehow also offensive closeness to suffering and death, not with Mephistophelian brutality, but gently, empathetically, and with love for others. Back then, the now-deceased test card editor Martin Busser was exemplary in his projective charging of the new emotionality represented by the emos with supposed impulses of radical criticism, from anti-folk to emacore, from Kimya Dawson, who dresses up as a rabbit or a dog at her gigs, sings along with babies in her album Alphabet, and whom Busser is almost the only person in Germany to have defended and made halfway known, to the type of permanently pubescent androgynous person who puts spangles in her hair and adorns herself with Hello Kitty buttons. From childhood to childishness, from sensuality, in which the contradictory needs of sex are alive, to gender-neutral emotionality, in a word, from criticism to reconciliation. Emotionality is the fading stage of affects. Pathos is the articulated awareness of their sovereignty, sensuality the individual experience of their drive. Emotionality, or as it was called in the 18th century as a counter-movement to the virile power humanism of the strikers and pushers, sensibility is the term for what remains of the affects when their pathos has dried up and sensuality, as their somatic correlate, has been thoroughly repressed. The category of emotionality hypostatizes as a spiritual or psychic quality what only possesses autonomy as long as it remains related to its material ground, to the drive structure of the subject and the diversity of the sensual world of appearances as its object. The ideology of sensibility lies sensuality into sensitivity, knows sex as eros at best and love not as physical desire, but only as feeling. This is why emotionality, insofar as it is elevated to a program, is usually to be distrusted. It tends towards the harmonization of contradictions, naive idealism and hostility towards the senses. Its postmodern triumphal march began with the zero category of attention, which at some point in the 1990s, when economies and cultures of attention were springing up everywhere, reduced the more selective concepts of experience and contemplation to an interdisciplinary mush. At around the same time, gender-sensitive language and cultural sensitivity became obligatory communication norms, and it is now not only in academic discussions that every contradiction is met with the request to be sensitive to differing opinions. Even business economists trained in epistemology have now discovered the value of emotionality, and participate in the archiving of emotions in various emotional clusters. Unfortunately, this emotional renaissance is similar to the emoticons used in emails and blogs by narrow-minded communication monads to compensate for their civilizational deficits. Affect, whether affectionate or idiosyncratic, tender or aggressive, coagulates into the grimace of the former substrate, which is presented to the addressee in a showy shamelessness. Just as the emoticon as an iconic turn-on replaces affect, which no longer needs to be articulated and therefore no longer needs to be experienced, because only what can be articulated can be appropriated as experience, so a society that encounters everyone with mediation, especially the mediation of the supposed immediacy of feeling, with hostility, injects itself with the disintegrated effects as visual stimulus response signals. Why bother expressing it when the emotional road signs are available everywhere? The love ideology appropriate to such automated emotionality, which is also crucial for understanding the emo cult, operates under the label of polyamory and still enjoys great popularity as soft-left group therapy. Polyamory is a reaction to the realization, which apparently can no longer be suppressed even in left-wing circles, that something has gone wrong with the sexual revolution, and acts as a final lifeline for people who are all the more proud not to be in a romantic relationship with two people, the more irrefutably they realize how meager and dishonest the open relationships are, which they need as a distinguishing feature from the romance they despise with the doggedness of disappointed lovers. Polyamory refers to a form of emotional promiscuity that seeks to extend the suspension of sexual monogamy, which is perceived as unsatisfactory in one's own reality of life, to the sphere of feelings. Because what one considers to be right, less out of insight than out of sexual political conviction, is not experienced as liberating but, on the contrary, as coercive, the prescribed libertinage, which for this very reason has never really been one, is now to determine not only the sexual but also the emotional life of individuals with increased severity. The totalitarian content of the call to adapt one's feelings to the progressive state of consciousness contrary to one's own inclination, must be denied all the more vehemently, the less the invoked erotic freedom can be concretized in one's own experience. The familiar experience that emotions can be stronger than convictions, i.e., that even if you grant your partner and yourself every freedom, another sexual relationship, which an open relationship should actually feel superior to, may be perceived as an affront, is transformed in the polyamory discourse into a call to eradicate any thought of exclusivity in one's own emotional household in the name of a freedom that has long since taken on a life of its own from a concrete experience to a decreed principle. The emotions that no human being has immediately, except in neurotic, ashamed, politicized, or otherwise pathogenic deformation, and which could at best be developed in a patient turn towards the particular, the individual, i.e., precisely in a form of loyalty that transcends the principle of ownership, are to be administered to individuals from outside, in a kind of emotional life reform, because it is no longer even possible to think of circumstances in which such an announcement would be superfluous. Precisely because individual love is not pursued or practiced like a business or profession, it is unthinkable without the moment of exclusivity. Even in the most insane obsession, the awareness that the whole that love wants can only be found in the particular resonates in a distorted way. Just as jealousy cannot be honored as the mere effect of an internalized logic of ownership, but expresses the fearful awareness of the irretrievability of the beloved person, so the idea of the only one who would be like no one else according to me does not simply testify to delusion, but also to knowledge that cannot be had without delusion. The particular individual who is fetishized by the exclusivity of love is, in its monadological form, also the appearance of something better, a world in which, in love, human nature would have escaped the constraints of nature. Out of fear of this freedom, polyamory replaces the romantic claim to exclusivity with a supposedly colorful, in reality dreary coexistence of feelings and needs that do not disturb each other because they are indifferent to each other. If the exclusivity of love in the hypostasis of the particular preserves the memory of that which in the individual eludes the principle of exchange that produced it in the first place, polyamory fakes universal indifference as the highest freedom. The seriousness that all lovers still possess in the moments of silliness, play and ecstasy is replaced by the celebration of unseriousness, which sanctions the interchangeability of the subjects. Because they have no idea of either the bourgeois or the romantic concept of love, the apologists of polyamory, in their efforts to develop a relationship management purged of irrational and anachronistic dross, descend into an empty pragmatism that is indistinguishable from the stalest romanticism. By rejecting the ideal of monogamy based on the model of bourgeois marriage as romantic, they obstruct their view of the dialectic of bourgeois and romantic love. The latter is not simply the ideology of the former, but rather polemically claims what the latter only promised. Bourgeois marriage as a contractual model, as first developed by Kant in the Metaphysics of Morals, at least formally abolished immediate domination, when sexuality and love were understood and lived in the pre-bourgeois forms of polygamy, but also in the extended family, which functioned as a living and working community. The differentiation of public and private spheres, nuclear family, partnership and working life that took place with the constitution of bourgeois society set love as a privileged sphere of freedom of purpose, the organization of which was decided solely by the individual needs of the participants. At the same time, however, the marriage contract that guarantees this freedom is a pure abstraction that must disregard everything individual in the name of its own validity. The love that defames polyamory as romantic is in fact already a response to the poor abstraction of the bourgeois marriage model, against which it asserts what polyamory wrongly sees as betrayed by romanticism: individuality, sensual pleasure and spontaneity, whose demands contradict the concept of monogamous marriage. Since the apologists of polyamory overlook the antagonism between bourgeois and romantic love, in their fight for the diversity of sensual needs supposedly gagged by the romantic ideology, they themselves fall into a regulatory frenzy that puts the contractual model of bourgeois marriage far in the shade. In order to please everyone in the private sphere under social conditions that inevitably place the individual in the wrong, the individual's emotions are subjected to a rigid control that would be unthinkable within the framework of bourgeois marriage, which does not care about the individual beyond his or her formal function as a contractual partner. Oliver Schott, who has developed the basic convictions of polyamory with a positivist precision that is unusual for the scene, is a good example of the unity of romanticism and regulatory frenzy. By calling his plea giving life beauty, and ending it with a wish that we may all become better people through love, he revokes romantic ideals, which are, however, characteristically emptied of all individuality. In a historically precise sense, it would be more romantic to want to give beauty to the beloved and not to life, about which those in love are sympathetically unconcerned, and the demand to develop into better people echoes the practical ethics against whose predecessors early romantic philosophy, which was more concerned with the inexhaustibility of man, turned particularly vehemently. However, polyamory is precisely about such a shallow ethics of feelings. Schott also emphasizes that the attempt to draw practical consequences from the criticism of the romantic model meant a lot of work on oneself when he describes how jealousy can be overcome in polyamorous relationships. Quote, "Genuine self-criticism is not limited to realizing that jealousy is stupid, you also have to act accordingly. It can make you feel pretty bad for a while, but that also applies to the next visit to the dentist." End quote. Leaving aside the question of whether love itself is not also stupid, according to practical reason, and has its dignity precisely therein, the principle we have to get through this should therefore apply to jealousy as well as to root canal treatment. This maxim is the only answer that polyamory has to the experience that almost no one today is happy through love, but almost everyone becomes sad, brutal, frightened away, impertinent, infantile, or stupid through it. You just have to be nice and sensible and pull yourself together a bit, then the right feelings would come all by themselves. Because any reflection on the fate of feelings today would have to start with the question of why there are so few lovable people, why we ourselves are hardly capable of love, and what the two have to do with each other. But such a reflection would not provide a community-building offer of faith. Polyamorists, who are not concerned with the ability to love, but with the ability to love as a social competence, invest their conversational energy in the collective suggestion that everyone would be better off if no one were to strive for all the happiness, but everyone were to strive for a slice for everyone. According to Schott, such a rational relationship model makes it easier to be completely open and honest with each other. Quote, "You need to be less afraid that certain needs or inclinations will cause irritation, as they can also find their place in other relationships. You no longer have to hide many feelings because they no longer interfere with or threaten to destroy the rules of the relationship." End of quote. Polyamory constantly talks about honesty, openness, and transparency. We have no secrets from each other is the magic formula, but never about individual happiness and sensual pleasure. That the needs that love is about are inseparable from the loved one and therefore cannot be easily moved to other places like messages in an email folder. That intimacy and secrecy, be it in the form of a carefully kept secret affair or the tics, quirks, and pet names by which the lovers recognize each other, are part of sexual happiness, indeed are essential to it. That a love without irritations would give itself up, because it would actually degenerate into that set of rules in which even bourgeois marriage has never exhausted itself. This does not occur to polyamorists, because the inner driving force behind their efforts is nothing other than the fear of the mystery itself, as which sex must appear to the reified consciousness, which is just as blindly at the mercy of the unenlightened drives as it is at the mercy of the incomprehensible authority of the superego. Consequently, polyamory deals neither with the concrete relationship between feeling and law, sexuality and morality, which is the subject not only of Kant's metaphysics of morals but also of romantic love philosophy, nor with concrete sexual needs, fears, or hardships. The omnipresent fear of not being able to fulfill the sexual desires of others or of betraying one's own inexperience, for example, or the fear of one's own, possibly destructive sexual desires, all the speechless, dark, unprocessed things that necessarily make up sexuality in contemporary society no longer play a role for polyamorists in view of the real possibilities we have today to shape our private lives and which most people simply do not know how to exploit in the sense of a moral and or hedonistic good life, due to a lack of insight. If, on the other hand, one-ops and polyamorists are convinced that this decision is open to everyone for a sensibly balanced promiscuity in the sense of practical emotional ethics, in which the affair does not jeopardize the relationship with a loved one, not too much china is broken in the heat of first love and no one has to feel and act according to the outdated categories of monogamy, a responsible hedonism takes the place of unreconciled antagonism, which already bears the stale compromise between romantic longing and sobering everyday life in its name. Even in antiquity, hedonism is not a doctrine of fulfilled happiness, but an ethic of limited pleasures that presupposes internalized renunciation. In this sense, polyamory is recommended as a contemporary psychotechnique that promises to reconcile the incompatible for people who have become as alien to the purposes of their existence as their own feelings. Enthusiasm and reason get along very well when everything has its place and its time, no one overreacts and no one puts more pressure on the other than on themselves. In this haze of feelings administered to the individual after his social death, as it were, as a therapeutic supplement to his atrophied reason, the figure of the sensitive man emerges, which is so paradigmatic of postmodernism and whose now fading pop-cultural image was the emo. Aesthetically and atmospherically, emacore owed its existence to two sources, with which it simultaneously contrasted, the hardcore and goth milieus. From hardcore, emacore adopted a certain aesthetic expressionism, an emphasis on authenticity and immediacy that formed an appealing contrast to the supposed slickness of postmodern serenity. However, emo resolutely opposed aggressive virility, the cult of rage and the brute male image, which it countered with the image of the sensitive man and a general androgyny, a vacillation between gender roles. His mode of expressivity was not anger, but grief, which of course no longer referred to concrete experiences of loss, but rather to a nebulous loss of the world. Musically, the shift in emphasis from hardcore to emacore was realized in the characteristic alternation between loud and quiet, whispered and shouted passages, in an interweaving of expressivity and inwardness, in which the fetishization of puberty as a phase of ostentatious immaturity typical of emacore is expressed. In it, the frustrations about the unsatisfactory reality are not yet alleviated according to the principle of reality, but are just as little able to concretize themselves, but remain stuck in the experience of narcissistic insult, which the sensitive ego defiantly holds up to its fellow world as a mark of sacrifice. In their glorification of passivity and indecision, as well as their preference for mixed moods, for thoughtfulness and melancholy, the emos were similar to the Goths, from whom they differed in their renunciation of mystical spinting and their playful approach to themselves and others. The fact that emos are persecuted, insulted and attacked as faggots, especially in Latin America, but also in southern European countries, was used as an argument for the subversive potential of their aesthetic and lifestyle. Their refined look, based on the Asian male image, appeared to be a counterdesign not only to the rage cult of hardcore, but also to Latin American machismo, which still enjoys uncritical popularity among multiculturalist leftists. However, the fact that emos were relatively likable because of such actual or imagined characteristics should not obscure the fact that the cult surrounding them arose from the same need as the revival of emotionality and sensitivity, the longing for the conflict-free resolution of contradictions, as expressed in the universal praise of androgyny. In a defense of emo culture for Jungle World, Martin Busser has compiled the most important elements of this longing. He begins by telling a few emo jokes. Why are emos no longer to be found in pubs after 12 o'clock? Because that's when happy hour starts. To continue as follows. Quote, the discriminatory content of the jokes made about emos already makes it clear what this rather introverted defensive group is accused of, namely that it suffers from the world. One of the popular stereotypes about emos is that they are constantly scratching themselves, i.e. inflicting cuts. However, this is not something that is specific to emos. Punks have also suffered from social conditions and expressed their frustration in rituals of self-destruction. But it is not suffering in the world alone that fuels hatred of emos, nor their more or less eccentric outfits, such as their dyed black hair and fingernails. If this were the case, followers of the Gothic movement would have to face similar hostility, which is not the case. The motive for the hostility towards emos is the combination of all this with a defensive, androgynous appearance. All statements against emos circulating on internet forums are latent, sometimes openly homophobic. In a Yahoo forum, a blogger comments, we found out that there are more emos who feel attracted to the same sex than normal people. And he underlines his understanding of normality a few lines later with a reference to music. Emos also think they listen to rock music, but that's not true, they're just wannabe rockers. In the rocker scene, this type of creature is quite unpopular. Homosexuality, according to those who hate emos, is something deficient and therefore just as fake as the music listened to by emos. In this reactionary link, which insists on a normality and rock authenticity, however outlined, the typical male fear of ruptures and ambivalences is expressed in the face of the imprecise and the undefined, with which emos playfully deal. In addition, this fear is linked to a diffuse hatred of everything intellectual, which is expressed in the fact that in connection with emos there is always talk of spoiled mama's boy high school students. The connection between androgyny, softness and a comparatively high level of education represents a maximum threat to male hegemony for the opponents. End quote. It is significant how the diagnosis of discrimination against a subculture is used here to infer that this group, precisely because of its marginality and suffering, represents something better for society in an immediate and substantial way, and how this better is then docked onto the gender and queer discourse as a fight against a supposed male hegemony. Quite apart from the fact that in homosexual subcultures in particular there are sometimes aggressive forms of male hegemony and in transgender and queer milieus there is a habitual rejection of introverted people, the question remains as to what should make suffering and defensiveness such a desirable attitude. At least in large parts of punk, the rituals of self-destruction were never simply an expression of frustration and suffering, but also of self-confidence, i.e. of a resistance that initially articulated itself destructively. The rocker scene was also more sensitive in its dealings with women within the scene, but above all with members of older generations, than Busser's text suggests, which paints a cliched picture of the rocker as a homophobic hooligan. It is possible that the identitarian moments of these scene cultures, their fear of the imprecise, of ruptures and ambivalences, can be deciphered as a distorted expression of the awareness that it is not enough to suffer from a bad reality in order to be able to resist it. The defensive, introverted character of emo culture proves to be questionable, especially in the face of the appearance of autonomy, which also manifests itself in such emphatic anger and aggression, as characteristics that must remain impotent despite their sympathy value, as long as they lack any concept of emphatic self-identity, are celebrated here as manifestations of a welcome new inwardness. Similarly problematic is the strangely vague status of sexuality in pop-cultural emo discourse, which is unintentionally outlined quite precisely by jokes about spoiled mama's boy high school students. After all, this metaphor places emos in the context of an immature masculinity that is melting away, as it were, in the stage of perpetual puberty, whose perpetual economic and social productivity crisis is to be compensated for by a cult of ethereal spiritualization and sensitivity. The psychological disposition that corresponds to this attitude actually resembles the aestheticism and dilettantism of the fin de siècle generation of sons, with its celebration of economic, aesthetic, and biological unproductivity, right down to its bodily aesthetic expression. The emos are thus part of the late bourgeois tradition of late-coming heirs who are neither able nor willing to take up the questionable legacy of their parents, but are also incapable of the spontaneity of a new beginning. Sexuality is consequently articulated in emo aesthetics, which is also close to aestheticism and Art Nouveau, primarily as an ethereal spiritualized capacity, which is positioned against the bourgeois fetishization of sexuality as biological reproduction, but which at the same time is inconsequential to a glorification of the vague, undecided, and thus also of the lack of decision and inability to act. In the environment of the late bourgeois subcultures, the emos figured to a certain extent as debrutalized punk sensitives who appropriated the refusal of productivity, as it is destructively turned against society in punk, as a cult of noble inwardness. In contrast to the body aesthetics of hardcore and punk, sexuality is thus perceived as something fragile, still unfulfilled in the individual, to which an aesthetic of brute self-expression does not do justice, but at the same time as a senseless impulse in which the emo ego can brood aimlessly and without consequences, without ever having to get down to business. This kind of senseless indecisiveness, which tolerates social antagonism rather than fighting it out, fits in with the ethos of self-abnegation and permanent moderation that preaches polyamory in order to eradicate the experience of the unity of pain and happiness from sexuality and to declare relationship conflicts to be a matter of association rather than conflict. This fetishization of passivity is ignored when, like Busser, people are enthusiastic about the emos being a shy but effective echo of the old understanding of youth and subculture. They take the right to daydream, to brood and indulge, they allow themselves a prolonged puberty. This assertion is underpinned by a quote from Adorno, who writes in his essay on the relationship between sociology and psychology in defense of puberty as an autonomous phase of life, the spirit that distances itself from immediate purposes, and which is given the opportunity to do so by those few years in which it has its powers at its disposal, is absorbed and blunted by the primacy of immediate purposes and the compulsion to acquire life, is slandered as mere narcissism. But where Adorno asserts the inherent right of puberty, i.e. those few years in which one has one's powers at one's disposal, over the primacy of immediate purposes and the compulsion to acquire, Busser praises a prolonged puberty that no longer has the goal of eventually leading to a form of adulthood that is perhaps finally humane. Whereas Adorno remains aware that those few years are always under the pressure of impending absorption, meaning that reflection and, above all, a certain resistance on the part of the individual is required in order to hold on to and develop those powers that are borrowed from him, Busser sees prolonged puberty as something that one treats oneself to like a special vacation. In place of the awakening sexuality, with whose fears, conflicts and wounds the vast majority of people struggle throughout their lives and which is no longer mentioned at all in Busser's work, the characteristics of puberty, as if in an echo of Bloch's idealistically kitschy Marxism, are the right to daydream and to brood and indulge, which, mind you, is not a matter of fact. So it is precisely not about the effort, never without wounds, to integrate the aspects of one's own sexuality that threaten the developing self, to mediate its demands with those of reality. It is no longer about mediation at all, but about stagnation, about an individuation denied in the name of suffering from the world, which, with its praise of introversion and dreaming, passes off abilities that can only be developed as individual, as community-building characteristics of a group. However, contrary to Busser's male-critical diction, the purpose for which these characteristics are to be used and which makes them appear so desirable is still a genuinely male one. The gender-political concept of emo in no way consists of a somehow subversive transgression of the boundary between the sexes, but rather in a self-feminization of the man, which allows the preferably pop or subcultural male subject to appropriate characteristics conceived as feminine as an unproblematic component of his own self. Emo is therefore not a model for a cultural revolutionary self-expression, but rather a model of appropriation, and in this respect it is alarmingly close to the much-vaunted androgyny, which has always been an arch-reactionary concept. In contrast to Butler's concept of gender transgression, which refers to the exaggeration, overplaying and collaging of role patterns that are considered natural, androgyny has been used throughout the history of the term since Plato to describe the conflict-free reconciliation of male and female gender characteristics in a feminized but masculine ideal self, which, by merging with the feminine, is finally allowed to share in the happy experience of its previously repressed female parts without its identity being seriously called into question. The simple fact that while male emos look androgynous and feminize themselves in fashion and gestures, female emos do not masculinize themselves at all, but rather emphasize traditionally feminine aspects of their own look through androgynous self-stylization, is regularly ignored when dealing with emo culture. However, it is precisely in its celebration of the transgression and liquefaction of male identity as an alleged cultural revolutionary dissolution of boundaries that emo culture is symptomatic of a tendency in the entire gender and queer debate, which is less and less about specific homosexual or transsexual people or the dominant character of gender relations, but rather the denunciation of any sexual identity, however determined, in the name of a diffuse in-betweenness, shifting and nomadization that is nothing other than the doubling of the social impossibility of individuation, which threatens the male subject, which represents the ideological archetype of bourgeois individuality, in a particularly obvious way. All the almost aggressive invocation of shyness and introversion, few things are as unpleasant in everyday life as penetrating shyness, is not really about finally being able to allow feminine, soft or tender parts of oneself, but on the contrary, about exorcising the socially long virulent experience of the fragility and ambivalence of the male gender character by integrating it into an androgynous model of reconciliation. In this respect, the type of fragile man, as projected by emo, represents the ideal polyamorous negotiating partner, ready to take himself back, without a stable ego and without identitary quirks. His weakness simultaneously represents a strength by means of which he can assert himself as a more flexible and reality-suited species compared to the older bourgeois models of his gender. The emotionality, that his fans understand as a commitment to a socially repressed quality, is in fact a means of adapting more smoothly to this very reality. Only seemingly does the postmodern hype of emotionality, sensitive love and emotional indecision stand in contrast to the time-honored prejudice that postmodernism is an era of coldness, superficiality and pretense, of the cheerful affirmation of reification and alienation. Rather, the authentic cult of these is long since history and was a genuine phenomenon of modernity. Its most important gender typological manifestations were the vamp and the dandy, its emphatic forms of expression, fashion and masquerade. Although the dandy can also be described as a feminized man and the vamp as a woman who has adopted the gesture of male sovereignty and coldness, both types appear backward and anachronistic in the age of postmodern emotionality, which praises gender diffusion and metrosexuality as the latest discovery. While polyamory and the slogan of emotionality work on the smooth reconciliation of world and self, the dandy and vamp gain their erotic power precisely from playing off antagonisms that are artificially exaggerated and stylized. Postmodern emotionality aims for a universal softness, a kind of foam-protected civil society in which all conflicts are negotiable, identities must a priori be fragile and precarious, and every effect generously and gratefully allows for its own opposite. The modern coldness of heart and habitus, on the other hand, as embodied by the dandy and the vamp, emphasizes the stark contrasts in order to allow them to turn into each other out of the tension of antagonism, just as the vamp stylizes himself as a woman through fashion and make up to such an extent that his femininity turns into threatening sovereignty, his beauty into demoniacism. The dandy cultivates distance and objectivity, impassivity and untouchability so excessively that they develop a power of attraction that emotion and affectivity could never arouse. Their coldness, which was already defamed by contemporaries as a symptom of typical modern alienation, actually preserves the awareness of the fragility of the heart, the pain of all desire and the unreconciled reality that is betrayed by the postmodern use of emotions as social cement. In mid-July 2021, the co-owner of a small publishing house announced, "This will probably soon be the fastest-selling book at Verbrecher Verlag." She was referring to the recently published volume Conformist Rebels, on the actuality of the authoritarian character. A few days later, not even a month after the first edition, the publisher reported that the book had gone into its second edition. It had already been mentioned on Deutschlandfunk 2 weeks earlier. The publisher is of course to be congratulated on this success. After all, everyone has to make a living from something. In addition, the attention that the volume is receiving is perhaps also rubbing off on some of Verbrecher Verlag's better books, such as Zeev Sternhell's Fascistische Ideologie, Ronald M. Skerniko's Legend or Gisela Elsner's Beruhungsverbot. Anyone who knows which country they live in should nevertheless ask themselves a question that has already been raised by the success of the Schurkamp volume containing Adorno's 1967 lecture on aspects of the new right-wing radicalism, which made it to number 2 on the Spiegel bestseller list. The question is, where does the enormous interest in a theory developed in the 1930s and 1940s by some Jewish intellectuals, who are usually denounced as aloof, negative, or bourgeois, come from? In any case, it cannot be due to the topicality of the authoritarian character referred to in the book's subtitle. This is not the case. We do not hold on to everything that is said in this book unchanged. That would be incompatible with a theory that ascribes a time core of truth instead of opposing it to historical movement as something unchanging. Max Horkheimer and Theodore W. Adorno wrote this in 1969, only 20 years after the first publication of The Dialectic of Enlightenment, in the preface to the new edition. Anyone who claims that something different applies to the 1930 study on workers and employees, the 1936 studies on authority and family, and the 1950 book on authoritarian personality, the three best-known studies by the Institute for Social Research on authoritarian character, more than 3/4 of a century after their publication, is not only arguing ahistorically. It also distances itself from one of the central basic assumptions of the theory of authoritarian character, which is mentioned in the introduction to Authoritarian Personality. Comprehensive changes in social relationships and institutions have an immediate effect on the types of character structures that emerge within a society. Contrary to what is suggested by some authors of conformist rebels, the concept of authoritarian character is neither a cipher for authoritarianism, racism, or susceptibility to fascist attitudes, as one contribution puts it, nor are its most important characteristics projectivity and stereotypical thinking. If this were the case, then most of the massacres and hunts in world history, from the persecution of Christians in ancient Rome to the medieval pogroms, would be the responsibility of authoritarian characters. They were largely based on projectivity and stereotypical thinking. Understanding it in this way makes the authoritarian character a suprahistorical, almost anthropological phenomenon. In contrast, the term is not only a social theoretical category, but is also closely linked to a specific epoch of capitalist development. When the staff of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research began to look for the causes of the absence of the proletarian revolution in the early 1930s, they came across family relationships that produced new psychological structures, the authoritarian character. In contrast to the bourgeois patriarchal families of the early bourgeois and liberal age, in which the father's authority was based on the precarious but nevertheless real function of great helmsman, provider, and protector, according to the thesis, paternal power had become irrational in the working class and white-collar families of early mass society. The authority that the father claimed within the family was in clear contradiction to his real powerlessness as the recipient of wages, orders, or handouts. The loss of the role model function was regularly compensated for by senseless orders, dressage, and excessive demands for respect. In addition, the draconian punishments with which the father reacted to the child's impulses had also lost at least part of their objective function. They were only partially the price that had to be paid for being able to master reality. In mass society, the prudent, disciplined, always controlled and morally upright patriarch of the bourgeois age was no longer in demand. He occasionally even proved to be a disruptive factor. The ambivalent feelings towards the father that resulted from these developments, anger, aggression, hatred, fear of losing love, contributed to the development of character structures in which the ego remained weak and sexuality regressed to pregenital levels. The consequences were pedantry, thriftiness, stinginess, an exaggerated sense of order, attacks of cleanliness, and fear of genital sexuality. The integration into authoritarian movements, the subordination to a leader who could also be called general secretary, but also the rebellion against the seemingly weak old and traditional, i.e. the conformist rebellion, had an attractive effect. The middle-class patriarchal families of the 1920s, that the staff of the Institute for Social Research had in mind for their research, as stated in the foreword to the studies on authoritarian character, no longer exist. As early as 1963, Alexander Mitscherlich's book Auf dem Weg zur Vaterlosen Gesellschaft was published, in which the further incident of paternal authority was reported. 2 years later, Frank Bockelmann spoke of the bad sublation of the authoritarian personality in Anschlag, the magazine of subversive action, a small group oriented towards critical theory and situationism. The father, he wrote quite rightly, had become contourless, sexuality had been released. Max Horkheimer, the initiator of the studies on the authoritarian character, spoke a short time later in his essay The Future of Marriage that it was in the process of disappearing. A great deal of the bad that the old firmly established bourgeois marriage produced, the tyranny of men over women and children, unhappiness when the marital relationship experienced a central, formed a chain of failures, is avoided by the new development. However, neither Horkheimer nor Mitscherlich and Bockelmann really wanted to rejoice. Horkheimer feared that human relationships would tend to dissolve and that the aura of the person could be permanently extinguished. That too was more than 50 years ago. The aura of the person has certainly not been completely extinguished, but traditional family structures have continued to erode. Strict subordination, discipline, and obedience, which were still clearly present in the 60s despite contrary developments, have long since ceased to be socially and professionally opportune. In place of the industrial or military order-taker, who carries out what he is told in a disciplined manner, the social ideal of the entrepreneurial self, as sociologist Ulrich Brockling calls it, has emerged. It does not wait for instructions or long for subordination to the strongest power, but gives free rein to its competencies independently, autonomously, dynamically, and creatively. These changes are also reflected in educational ideals. Corporal punishment is not only forbidden, it is also socially frowned upon. Children's impulses are rarely met with major resistance. On the contrary, they are encouraged. If they express themselves in the form of displeasure or screaming fits, parents often react not with a difficult mixture of love and the nevertheless necessary demand for drive suppression, which is one of the prerequisites of civilized interaction, but with reward and drive diversion. If you apologize to Aunt Alina, you'll get a new toy at home. It is fitting that parents see themselves less and less as the family's main staff, but rather as partners, buddies, or friends of their children. They want to be respected and cherished less than they want to be loved. The result is little monsters who are not in danger of marching in rank and file to Tobruk, because they are hardly capable of a necessary subordination, but who terrorize everything and everyone arbitrarily in the urge for immediate drive discharge. Authoritarian ego weakness has been replaced by new forms of narcissism and the fraying of the ego. These may all be phenomena that can be observed above all in the new middle class. But even in the less educated classes, who are often assumed to be closer to family authority and violence, whether rightly or wrongly remains to be seen, it has long been observed that children are not being given too narrow boundaries, but none at all. Child and youth therapists, special educators, teachers at schools for the learning disabled, the custodial institutions of the precariat, report that the problem is less domestic authority, which is by no means to be confused with violence, than its almost complete loss. Anyone who assumes the unbroken topicality of the authoritarian character against this backdrop is not only deflating the concept, they are also ignoring what Max Horkheimer also stated in his 1966 essay on the future of marriage. The mass media of television, radio, cinema had long since largely taken over education, and with them, at the latest today, all the stars, starlets and influencers that the pop culture industry, which now also includes sport, produces nonstop. With regard to schools, which have replaced the family as a further social educational authority, Horkheimer claimed that more professional rather than educational tasks were performed there. In 1966, he was still able to make a distinction between vocational and civic education, but this difference has since been eliminated. The almost complete congruence of vocational education with what Horkheimer called education in the proper sense is bundled in the omnipresent pedagogical concept of general competence to act, which only recalls the distinction between work and leisure, public and private in the subdivision of professional competence. As a subdivision of self-competence, social competence and methodological competence, action competence has the function of leveling all areas of society without barriers. With the erosion of what used to be called the separation of the spheres of production and reproduction, another social constitutive condition of the authoritarian character is also eroding. Instead of its disappearance, one could also speak of the obsolescence of the authoritarian character, following Herbert Marcuse. In his 1963 essay The Obsolescence of Psychoanalysis, Marcuse emphasized that the extent to which supposed progress is in reality repression is revealed precisely in the observation of the obsolete object. Quote, "The development of contemporary society has replaced the Freudian model with a social atom whose psychic structure no longer has the quality that Freud attributed to the psychoanalytic object." End quote. It was also clear to Marcuse that society has long since directed the emerging ego immediately through mass media, school and sports groups, gangs of young people, etc. Because the family was no longer a mediating and negotiating instance between the ego and the ego ideal, the social ego ideal had an immediate effect on the individual and thus led to immediate identification with one's own kind and the administered reality principle. It is not surprising that where the topicality of the authoritarian character is invoked, there is no mention of the state as the central immediate instance of socialization. In Konformistisch Rebellen, for example, there is hardly a word, and certainly not a critical one, about it and its role in upbringing and education. It is a misunderstanding that it would withdraw in general and either in a neoliberal, post-Fordist or post-Keynesian way and hardly fulfill its educational mission, which is widespread far beyond the circle of conventional critics of neoliberalism. The proclaimed post-industrial education location of Germany stands for precarious or deregulated working conditions, but not for less state, or rather for what Louis Althusser not so wrongly described as ideological state apparatuses. Today's immediate identification with the ego ideal, of which Marcuse spoke, takes place at school via the teacher, who functions there less as a father substitute than as the embodiment of the state, and with it everything that it stands for and is supposed to stand for. Regardless of the almost completely changed educational and state ideals, which are also reflected in the changed appearance of the teacher's general function is thus quite traditional. His new unmediated and immediate socialization function results from the abolition of father and family, and thus also of the relationship between the teacher and father or mother in late bourgeois society, which first developed the authoritarian character as a decidedly late bourgeois phenomenon. Today, in post-bourgeois times, in which the state competes with the culture industry at best, but prefers to cooperate with it, it has an almost unmediated grip on the individual, not only despite, but also because of the rights that are now granted to the so-called pupil personality. The much-troubled parents who threaten the school at the slightest feeling of injustice towards their offspring with their approach to the principal or with a lawyer are not necessarily in contradiction to this. Firstly, there are not as many of them as is occasionally claimed. Secondly, in their paranoid fear of discrimination against their own offspring, in their insistence on their uniqueness, the feeling of permanent disadvantage and the associated willingness to declare themselves the general enemy, they are often just taking social imperatives to extremes. Civil society in particular has a special role to play in this context. It is integrated and functionalized by the state, making it almost impossible to distinguish between the interests of the state and those of civil society. The state education for postmodern tolerance, which is deregulated by civil society and often referred to as respect, and which brought the phenomenon of so-called external education providers onto the scene in the first place, is less concerned with education for maturity as an educational ideal than with identitarian affiliation. To a certain extent, it also stands for the obsolescence of the concept of tolerance, which is still committed to the individual. Education to respect the usually collective other provides a free license for extraterritorialization. It is true that the fetishization of otherness, which is associated with keywords such as diversity and empowerment, is not pursued for the purpose of promoting Islamic counter-societies. They are seen as. However, they are accepted as a cost and collateral damage of a cosmopolitan society. With regard to the question of the topicality of the authoritarian character, this means that the term is certainly not transferable to the members of Islamic counter-societies. They do not stand for the crisis of the bourgeois nuclear family, which the term factually presupposes, but rather for the erosion of the pre-bourgeois patriarchal blood surges, Marx, the overcoming of which by bourgeois or late bourgeois society. The term implies that ticket mentality, stereotyping, or the tendency to conspiracy thinking are by no means part of the exclusive copyright of authoritarian characters. Above all, however, it is linked to a phenomenon that Frank Bockelman described more than 50 years ago. In his 1965 essay The Bad Sublation of the Authoritarian Personality, there are certainly numerous questionable points, from anti-Americanism to the rigorism of many statements. The majority of Americans, it says, for example, are already incapable of unambiguous moral judgment. With regard to the replacement of the traditional authoritarian character, the text was nevertheless ahead of its time, perhaps also because Bockelman instinctively recognized the infantile narcissism of subversive action, to which he belonged just as much as Dieter Kunzelmann, Rudi Dutschke, and Bernd Rabel, as avant-gardism. The term Aufhebung in particular is well chosen due to the threefold Hegelian meaning of the word. The authoritarian character was abolished in that it was, firstly, both destroyed and secondly, preserved and thirdly, raised to another level. Among other things, the gesture of juvenile awakening against the supposedly old, which today takes place primarily under the slogan of anti-authoritarianism, was preserved. The gesture of purity was also preserved, which seems to have shifted not least to language. Nevertheless, the talk of the actuality of the authoritarian character is above all a defensive instrument, an instrument to ward off reality. It almost seems as if a reversal has taken place. The first generation of critical theorists also dealt with socio-psychological questions because the society of the time could no longer be grasped with the means of sociology, economic criticism, and historical science. When a glance at the feature pages, the politics section, or the business pages of the major newspapers is no longer sufficient to explain the present, then the hour of social psychology has come. Today, however, talk of the authoritarian character seems to serve the purpose of neither having to deal with political, economic, and social conditions nor having to reflect on the social function it fulfills in cultivating the enemy image of the state and its civil society agencies. If one were to seriously consider the obsolescence of the authoritarian character, then one could even ask, against the background of the reasons given for this obsolescence, whether Marcuse's observation that, under the conditions of the obsolescence of psychoanalysis, activated attack energy necessarily needs its very concrete and personified object in the common enemy outside the group, could have something to do not only with the AfD and other right-wing populists, but also with one's own endless struggle against the right. The anthology Konformistische Rebellen, on the other hand, is supposed to explain the rise of populism, The publisher's advertisement even talks about socially changed conditions. In most of the contributions, however, neither society nor change is mentioned. Social conditions are reduced, almost in terms of systems theory, to major structural principles that have existed for almost 200 years, which, in contrast to Niklas Luhmann's statements, are labor, value, and capital accumulation. The current conditions, the transformation of labor relations, the change in family relationships, the new approach to sexuality, the new social question, the change in social stratification, etc., are only mentioned in passing as illustrations. Furthermore, the question is not even posed as to whether joining the AfD, the Polish PiS, Donald Trump, or the Czech ANO is really such a clear submission to irrational authorities as suggested in the blurb. There is no question that the election of populist parties has projective moments. They also attract neo-Nazis and other unpleasant figures. Nevertheless, they are neither fascist nor national socialist organizations. Moreover, in addition to all the projective elements, the choice of populists often also has clearly rational components, and not only because the mental structure of the new character types is, as Böckelmann puts it, more in line with reality than the schizophrenia of authoritarianism. The fear of decline, which according to many surveys is one of the most important reasons for voting for populists, is in no way irrational, but justified. The United States is one of the best examples. In 2017, 47 million Americans, around 15% of the population, lived in poverty. More than half of workers earned less than $30,000 a year and were therefore part of the working poor. Child poverty has also increased. In 2007, 1 in 8 American children was dependent on food stamps. 10 years later it was already 1 in 5. At the same time, life expectancy has even fallen for the first time in a long time due to the decline of the former white middle classes, an absolute novelty since the end of the Second World War. Although the figures are less dramatic in Germany, child and old age poverty have also risen significantly here. The decline and exclusion of entire population groups, which has been accelerated by the introduction of Hartz IV, clearly shows even those who are still better off how fleeting their own happiness can be. This is particularly true for those whose professional and social profile does not match the catalogue of requirements. This is probably one of the reasons why they are more likely than average to vote for populists. One could almost say that they really have hardly any alternative. The reforms introduced by the Red-Green coalition, reduction in government spending, privatization of public services, deregulation of the labor market, have undoubtedly set a neoliberal course. Despite the lamentations of many opponents, however, the Hartz reforms by no means mark the end of state welfare in favor of a supposedly market-radical social cutback based on the American model. Unlike in the USA, the Hartz reforms here stand for increased state immediacy. The new, activating welfare state is not a liberal night watchman state geared towards social deregulation, but an expression of an authoritarian re-regulation of social relations and in this respect an original social democratic invention. Many left-wing opponents of neoliberalism have remained blind to the connection between economic disintegration and state integration. Their one-sided criticism was directed in the name of the interventionist state against the unleashing of locust capital and the emergence of a police-armed authoritarian night watchman state. In Germany, it was the SPD that re-regulated the welfare state with Hartz IV. In the United States, it was Democrat Bill Clinton, the husband of Trump's biggest rival Hillary Clinton, who abolished federal welfare guarantees in 1992. By the end of his term in office, the number of Americans without health insurance had risen to a new record high. Around 40% of the population had no health protection at all. If Trump is elected against this backdrop, it goes without saying that this does not have to be sympathetic. It is certainly not particularly clever either. A return to the certainties of modernity with the agitated means of postmodernism, which populism stands for, is more than unlikely. However, it is unlikely to be much more irrational than relying on the current SPD, the CDU, the Greens, or the Left Party to bring about the necessary changes. On the other hand, those who explain the rise of populism along the lines of historical fascism and National Socialism with the actuality of the authoritarian character, with irrationality or the longing for command and obedience, without at least mentioning the ambivalences of populism, not only relativize historical fascism and National Socialism, but also confirm the status quo. To the extent that the concrete conditions for the rise of the AfD, the PiS, the ANO, or Donald Trump are kept silent, they are legitimized. The talk of the actuality of the authoritarian character, presented in a critical gesture, threatens to promote precisely what the editors of the anthology want to recognize in the rise of populism, a conformism that pretends to be rebellious. Florian from Schwert has made up his mind. At some point you reach an age where you want to do your own thing, says the 21-year-old journalism student, explaining his decision to move out of his parents' house and into a shared flat in the jargon of a minor who has come of age. Meanwhile, another Florian from the same report, who works at the ASTA of the University of Munich, has left his shared flat and moved back into his parents' house, although he did not have to give up his independence. Quote, I do my own washing, ironing, cleaning, and help with the cooking. I also don't live on the same floor as my parents, so I don't get in their way when I come home at night. End of quote. Florian from Schwartz certainly also takes part in the cooking in his shared flat, while Florian from Munich does his own thing as an ironing secretary. But it is only the double Florian who reveals what escapes the individual, that moving out with one's parents, which the bourgeois family knew as a conflict-laden and necessary act of detachment from the constraints of origin based not on blood but on social relations, has now largely lost its symbolic and practical significance in Western countries. Whether one moves into one's parents' apartment or a student flat share as a base for one's life's work, to which one's own apartment, which often enough consists of just one room, has shrunk, is objectively irrelevant if the parents, who have mutated from contradictory authorities into professional educational coaches, merge with friends, colleagues and acquaintances, who have been upgraded to an extended family, into a single company noodle community. Alexander Kramer from the Central Student Advisory Service at the University of Bremen sums up this development, which is not only due to necessity, but also meets the subject's need for conflict-free freedom, which replaces the caesura that moving out of the parent's home once meant in the individual's experience with a seemingly uncontradictory permanent self-transformation, when he aptly describes studying as a maturity test, i.e. as what is actually a prerequisite for studying. The more the bourgeois family disintegrates as a historical form, the more its function becomes generalized, because the unfree conditions under which it developed and which it never merely expressed, but which it always resisted, have not been happily abolished. The maturity test still made the subjects believe that they were from now on released into their own lives in both a good and a bad sense, where the whole of life is a single challenge against which one must constantly measure oneself anew. Education, training and profession, on the other hand, become an endless and unqualified series of aptitude tests that have lost all rational purpose. The ordinariness of this experience in the denaturalized civil society makes it easier for its members to appreciate the repressive paternalism of the Islamic Family Association in its modern and progressive aspects. Gabi Strasberger, professor of social work at the Catholic University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, comments on the fact that marriages between blood relatives are not only common in Arab countries, but also among Islamic family groups living in Western countries. Just like Germans, you find your partner in your personal network, only in this case, it is kinship. Gunter John, press spokesman for Lebenshilfe Berlin, explains the rare use of social care services by Muslim migrants with relief and admiration. They are all cared for within the family because this has a completely different value in their culture. End quote. Supportive social work does not want to know that it can make a life-saving difference in a specific case, whether a girl who has become pregnant unintentionally seeks help in a women's shelter or in the family, whether the ailing grandmother is cared for in a hospice or by the clan, precisely because the family is not just any network, but a coercive association whose coercive character becomes all the more unpleasant the less pronounced the distinction between public and private is. Although in emergencies better help can be expected from the conglomerate of family, friends and colleagues that is replacing the bourgeois family as well as the self-chosen circle of acquaintances in Western countries than from the personal network of Muslim family associations, the two phenomena belong together. The idea of using the metaphor of the network borrowed from modern forms of communication to describe a coercive community sworn to blood ties, honor and loyalty, which is hostile to any form of mediation and, according to its content, asocial and prevents socialization, can only come to those who no longer have any concept of the family as a social relationship in its various manifestations. Because they consider their inability to judge pluralism and the leveling of civilization and barbarism into equally respectable manifestations of culture to be evidence of critical consciousness, the social networkers see the ease with which Muslim family associations replace the institutions of disintegrating bourgeois sociality as progress, without recognizing it as progress for the worse. Indeed, they envy the family clans which, in contrast to Western individualism, always have responsibility for the whole in mind, even for the spontaneously occurring interplay of efficiency, violence and warmth of heart that the eroded bourgeois institutions, which can no longer rely on a traditional family structure, first have to laboriously produce through ideological mumbo-jumbo, from neuropedagogy to the multi-generational home. Accordingly, the quoted Welt article on the taboo subject of incest is not at all bothered by the practical living conditions that promote marriages between relatives and which have little to do with Western ideas of romance and falling in love, as it says in amazement. Instead, the Apology of Natural Social Welfare by Emily G. is quoted approvingly, emphasizing that everyone is provided for in this way. For me, it was quite natural to marry my cousin. In contrast, the article takes offense at the fact that due to the high number of marriages between blood relatives in migrant milieus in Berlin-Neukölln, a particularly large number of children are born with congenital disabilities. This puts the text in line with those who see the German Ethics Council's recommendation to legislators in September 2014 to legalize incest between siblings under certain conditions as a threat to public hygiene. Reinhard Müller, who wrote in the FAZ, September 25, 14, from the statement incest, that's a taboo from ancient times to a commitment to hereditary biology in just 3 sentences, spoke for them all. Quote, "This is about terms that one hardly dares to utter anymore: family, eugenics, public health." End of quote. Because he sees the family not as a social relationship, but as a natural blood bond, as a germ cell, in this he agrees with the Islamic family ideology, which he finds suspicious in terms of public health, but socially quite sympathetic. Müller manages to lament the threatened big picture in 3 further sentences. Quote, "The family is an order with certain places: father, mother, children. This order is in danger. Sexual self-determination must take a back seat to the protection of children. They need a safe space to grow up as unencumbered as possible. The welfare of children is also being consequentially downplayed in the course of the leveling of marriage in favor of same-sex civil partnerships. There is even a connection here with the ban on incest. In times of increasing surrogate motherhood and artificial insemination, parentage is becoming less important. Yet every child has a father and a mother." End of quote. The connection between incest, gay marriage, surrogate motherhood, and artificial insemination is in fact created solely by the resentment that rejects them as equally harmful on the way to a world in which healthy children born from natural face-to-face fertilization, who know their family tree by heart, cuddle up with their biological parents unencumbered in a safe space. The fact that the supporters of the ban do not even notice how closely this constellation resembles the incestuous one, which does not simply destroy the family, but presupposes it and arises from it, is based on a misjudgment of the specific character of the incest taboo, which the supporters of the legal ban share with its critics. The TAS, which took the vote of the Ethics Council as an opportunity to call for freedom for sibling love, also behaved as a family protector in the name of incest and unexpectedly lapsed into Korthsmaller style when apologizing for something that already existed in Greek legends. Quote, "These are heartbreaking stories. Families are torn apart, fathers end up in prison, everyone suffers. Because 2 people who weren't allowed to find each other have found each other." End quote. It is no coincidence that such a lament about destroyed families and disempowered fathers sounds like an attempt to promote sexual tolerance with Erika Steinbach. The larmoyant sensitivity for 2 who have found each other, with which gender leftists suddenly become apologists for the romantic relationship between 2 people, is all the more suspicious as the 2 people in question did not find each other as unknown individuals, but as siblings, the Saxon half-siblings Patrick S. and Suzanne K., whose case gave rise to the Ethics Council's opinion, had met in 2000. S. was 24 at the time and K. was 16. Both had grown up separately because S. had been sent to a home at the age of 3 due to his father's violence, while K. was the child of their mother's second husband. S. and K. gave birth to 4 children, 2 of whom are disabled. The couple is now divorced. The assumption that the knowledge of the relationship had influenced the development of their relationship is therefore also obvious to the well-intentioned person. S. as the partner who was of age at the time of the incest, was convicted of sexual intercourse between relatives under Section 173 of the German Criminal Code and served 3 years in prison. The Federal Constitutional Court rejected the appeal against the sentence in 2008, and the European Court of Human Rights rejected the appeal against the Verf's ruling in April 2012. The disproportionality of the sentence, which is all the more obvious as the sentence was not justified solely on the grounds of preserving family order and considerations about the risk to children's health, but on the grounds of protecting sexual self-determination, which incestuous relationships obviously violate per se, makes it unquestionably necessary to also denounce the violation of the self-determination of those who are being criminalized here in the name of sexual self-determination. But on the one hand, this is only an argument against the case law and not against the underlying law. On the other hand, the moralizing tone with which the discrimination of another victim group by the law and the state is scandalized makes it doubtful that the advocates of lifting the incest ban are really concerned with the separation of law and morality. While the majority of the ban's defenders aim to merge taboo, morality, and law in a universalistically camouflaged right of conviction, the ban's critics are more concerned with culturalizing the incest ban as an expression of a particular morality and thus with relativizing the taboo, which is admittedly not identical to the ban. The lack of clarity about the relationship between taboo, law, and morality characterizes the entire discussion about the incest ban. It is rooted in the subject matter itself. On the one hand, the prohibition of incest, where it is enshrined in law in bourgeois states, obviously has an irrational element. It is a special law because in all cases in which the incest violates individual legal interests, especially in cases of sexual abuse, frequently associated with incestuous relationships. This could be punished on the basis of the existing legal system, without incest having to be fixed as a special criminal offense. Sanctions should therefore be imposed, and this applies to almost all states in which incest is punishable, on incest as such, sexual violence in incestuous relationships, and also not on endangering the health of possible children, because the prohibition of incest is not directed solely against reproduction, but against sexual relationships between blood relatives in general. It sanctions violations of a universal taboo of civilization, even where the respective violation is not accompanied by any violation of individual legal interests. In addition to Germany, incest is also punishable in Australia, Canada, Chile, Denmark, England, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Romania, Sweden, Switzerland, and almost all states in the USA without the addition of sexual abuse, coercion, etc. In Sweden, incest between half-siblings is legal. In France, criminal liability was abolished as early as 1810 with the introduction of the Code Penal. Today, incest is unpunishable in all states that follow the Code Penal. Adoptive parents and step-parents are almost never included in the threat of punishment. In Western countries where incest is legal, it does not occur significantly more frequently than in those that criminalize it. Where it is prohibited, criminal liability also applies in some cases to acts similar to sexual intercourse, such as oral and anal sex. In France, the extent to which incest must have an aggravating effect on the penalty for sexual abuse has been repeatedly discussed. For the legal situation, see the presentation by the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Criminal Law. It is precisely for this reason that the prohibition, when applied to the individual case, appears to be an ethical right that sanctions a morally unethical act, not a violation of legal interests. The infamy of the eugenic argument, which was used in the proceedings against Patrick S. to justify the judgment and is characteristic of German case law, results from the fact that it could be used to prohibit all procreation with an increased risk of giving birth to disabled children, which is probably what many who use it actually want to do, i.e., from its affinity to the protection of the people, which turns the universalist content of the incest prohibition into its opposite. On the other hand, the prohibition of incest is a very special law that differs fundamentally from others, such as those that apply or are required for religious and cultural communities. Because it is primarily a commandment to transcend the community of blood, and any jurisdiction would have to take this into account, the instruction to leave the family behind in sexual relationships, whether they lead to the founding of a family or serve solely to fulfill individual lust, to seek happiness not with one's own kind but with others, to whom one in turn resembles, mediating between the self and the other. In this sense, the prohibition of incest is a prerequisite for all society. In this sense, and its critics want to know as little about this as its supporters, it also contains an imminent criticism of the family unit, which is not the last, but only the first in biographical terms, and is also the first to become social, and which still has to be transcended as a community of origin by those who form one themselves. What precedes all law as a precept of civilization appears, where it is applied as law, as an anachronism. Whether the civilization constituting character of the prohibition of incest can be grasped as a law, to what extent the pre-legal taboo must be mediated in the law or abolished by it, these questions would allow an approach to the problem. However, it is precisely the contradictory relationship between taboo, morality, and law that is vehemently suppressed in the discussion about the incest ban. Supporters of the ban tend to combine all three levels and, instead of emphasizing the universalist content of the law, see it merely as a constitutionally camouflaged punishment for breaking a taboo, which is not seen as constituting society but as creating community. The punishment that follows the breach of a taboo is thus interpreted in terms of revenge and atonement, rather than as a constitutionally justified response to the breach of a principle constituting society. This is why the concept of consanguinity and folk biological ideologisms play such a dominant role in the arguments of the opponents. The universalist content of the prohibition of incest, that it is a commandment to transcend blood ties, is made unrecognizable by replacing its community-transcending meaning with a community foundation of the taboo, even if it is in the name of an Occidental cultural community. The opponents of the ban, on the other hand, want to completely sever the link between taboo and law, disavow the ban as an expression of a culture-dependent morality, and replace the one special law with numerous special rules to be adapted to each particular case. While the universalist content of the incest ban is relativized in this way, the fantasies attached to incest are to be perhorsed more drastically than before, according to the Ethics Council's proposals. The vote of the Ethics Council recommends the legalization of consensual acts of incest between siblings who no longer live together as a family and of whom either both are of legal age or one is of legal age and the other is over 14 and under 18 and can be considered sexually mature. Why incest should not also be legalized for siblings who are both over 14 and under 18, as would be covered by sexual criminal law, is just as incomprehensible as the demand that both siblings should no longer be allowed to live together as a family. In the case of legal incest, the former favors a significant age difference, as in the case of Patrick S. and Suzanne K., which has just led to the conviction of the man as the superior participant. The latter assumes that the family is a fundamentally different, less coercive experience for those living outside the family unit than for those living in the family, and ignores the fact that the principle of consanguinity, precisely because it is a social one, does not simply lose its effect when the family unit is abandoned. There is also, as council member Michael Wunder himself admitted, no logical argument for continuing to punish incest between parents and adult children across the board in the context of the Ethics Council's argumentation. If one dispenses with hereditary biological justifications for the prohibition of incest and, as the Ethics Council does, one conceives of it merely as a culturally relative moral standard for the enforcement of which criminal law is not a suitable means, then this would have to apply to all incest, provided that no individual legal interest is violated by it. The Ethics Council's opinion becomes completely opaque when sex between siblings between an adult and a minor partner over the age of 14 is to be punished even more severely than before if both are still living in the family, in that other sexual acts of considerable weight are now also to be sanctioned. As violations of the incest ban in Germany have so far only been legally prosecuted if they involve genital sexual intercourse, the implementation of the Ethics Council's proposals would partially decriminalize incest, but would mean a tightening of sexual criminal law for those acts of incest that are still punishable. The tangle of rules recommended by the Council gains a certain coherence if it is understood as the expression of a dual intention: the relativization of the prohibition of incest as a civilization imperative and the legal anchoring of a sexual morality based on negotiation and so-called sexual self-determination, which incest partners will also have to adhere to in future in order to avoid punishment. This is clearly expressed in the vote in the formulation that criminal law does not have the task of enforcing moral standards for the sexual intercourse of responsible citizens. In the reference to the sexual intercourse of responsible citizens, which not coincidentally sounds like an administrative term for universal sexual dreariness, the legal concept of responsibility is diffusely mixed with a moral concept of responsibility, and this is precisely the point of the Ethics Council's considerations, which revolve around the idea of the responsible incest couple, who have themselves and each other completely under control, who are aware of the social, moral, and psychological difficulties of their relationship, who have internalized the nuns of sexual negotiation morality and thus prove that in the self-transparent organization of their everyday life and love, they are neither oriented towards the elitism of overbred nobles nor the raw regression of degenerate hillbillies. For this reason, the existence or non-existence of a lived family bond, as a criterion for incest punishability, runs through the entire opinion. The distinction between living and non-living family ties, which plays an eminently progressive role in the legal strengthening of social as opposed to biological parenthood, blurs the function of the prohibition of incest as a commandment of civilization, against which an incest relationship also violates if a living family tie does not exist and the incest partners are biographically alien to each other. And this is not for biological reasons, but for psychodynamic reasons, namely because consanguinity as a social relationship does not lose its psychosocial significance for the subject simply because the family unit is not a living one. The Ethics Council could have recognized this from the statements made by those affected by the law, which do not revolve around the individuality of the respective foreign relative but, conversely, obsessively around the magic, charm and attraction of the fact of kinship. And in which the moment of defiance, the conviction that sexual love can possibly only be experienced as a heroic breach of social taboo in incestuous relationships, is just as important as the topos of love as a force of destiny, as which it apparently no longer comes over individuals in objectively banal exogamous partnerships, but only in incest. In the statements collected by the Ethics Council from those affected, this becomes particularly clear in one woman's account of her first encounter with her previously unknown half-brother. Quote, "I saw him on the platform and at that moment all doubt ceased. I simply couldn't defend myself. I couldn't. Although there was so much against it, we got involved with each other. The feelings overwhelmed us. We talked and saw all the problems in front of us, but the feelings were bigger. It was us against the rest of the world." End quote. Obviously, the knowledge of the known or just discovered relationship does not simply play a disturbing role in the development of incest relationships, but a constitutive role. Ex negativo, this confirms that the prohibition of incest has at its core not a biological but a psychosocial function, and that this can only be abandoned at the price of breaking with civilization. Similar to the obsessive search of some adopted children for their unknown biological parents, which is based on unfounded mystification of ancestry against the social family bond, incest relationships, contrary to the depiction of the ancient myth, arise quite essentially from the belief that intimacy between people is more unquestionably and unconditionally guaranteed in the ancestral bond than towards social strangers. The always already existing blood relationship is absolutely primary, compared to the heart relationship, which must first be discovered and realized by the individuals. It is precisely the rejection of this belief, which is fundamental to the universalist character of the prohibition of incest as a commandment of civilization, that is no longer given any significance at all in the considerations of the Ethics Council on the different functions that incest has in practical or formal legal consanguinity and in the specific roles, typically assumed by members of a family. At the same time, the numerous special considerations on incest between legally consenting partners and partners who are still minors and the recommended tougher penalties for other sexual acts of considerable weight. If in such a case both partners are still living in the family unit, implement elements of the tougher sexual offenses legislation in the considerations on incest. What was previously sanctioned by the criminal law on incest is to be replaced in future by a setting of regulations on the ability of the partners involved in incest to consent, differentiated according to the individual case, but thereby also offering broad scope for arbitrariness. The whole complex of problems associated with incest is thus dissolved into categories of sexual self-determination, negotiation, and consent. This is why incest between parents and even adult children should remain prohibited. It is assumed that the capacity to consent is not given a priori here due to the hierarchy, why new special regulations are proposed for minors, whose capacity to consent is questioned a priori, and why the ban on incest between sexually self-determined siblings living independently of each other should be completely abolished, without even a single sentence being spent on the ethical and political question of whether it is possible to speak of sexual self-determination in such cases in more than a formal legal sense. Fundamental to this concept of social control of incest replacing the legal prohibition, which in turn is to be legally codified, is the fiction of the completely self-transparent responsible citizen, who is always fully aware of the causes and possible consequences of his actions and in this sense capable of negotiation and consent, which also determines the morality of sexual criminal law all the more strongly the more obviously the real subjects mock the concept of responsibility, which is applied to them as a formal legal category. The extent to which individuals themselves identify with this fiction in view of the bad sublation of the bourgeois family in various familial collegial networks is shown by their blindness to the constitutive significance that leaving the family has for individuation and to which the prohibition of incest points. It is only this blindness that makes it possible for adults, since they are of age, to take no offense at returning to the family unit they have just left, that hardly anyone is offended by living conditions in which brothers, cousins, aunts and grandfathers function as employers, spouses, moral guardians and social security in personal union, and that the mature citizen can use the progressive detour of social networks to download not only a baggage of strangers and semi-acquaintances, but also justifiably forgotten school friends and their own family members as contacts on their smartphone. Characteristic of all social relationships today, whose complete mediation appears to the subjects as the availability of the social that is completely subject to their own arbitrariness, while every impotent expression of the possibility of freedom of purpose is perceived as an encroachment, is the elimination of all distances between individuals based on mediation, while at the same time the distance between them is suspended and appears more insurmountable than ever. This is why the transformation of family members, friends, colleagues. This is why the transformation of family members, friends, acquaintances and lovers into contacts is an adequate expression of what people do to each other, and why gestures that solicit closeness in the awareness of distance, articulating respect and affection at the same time, are no longer understood at all. In the world of clear announcements, whose crudeness, dullness and banality are the aesthetic equivalent of what passionate politicians call transparency, there is only yes or no, stop or go, red or green, and the differentiation, delicacy and friendliness of the forms of social intercourse that people have developed in their history and which are the epitome of what civilization may be called, regresses to the highest technological level to the highway code. The proposals to transform the prohibition of incest into a code of rules of negotiation and consent ultimately aim to catch up with this process of regression in the relationship between taboo, morality, and law. The incest prohibition itself does not fit at all into a world of clear announcements, because it does not articulate a command, but a contradiction. Historically, long before the emergence of the bourgeois family, the prohibition of incest expressed the dual character of the family unit, which only came into its own and became conscious of itself in the bourgeois family, in that the family is the precondition for the possibility of incest and, the less it sees itself as a private institution antagonistically belonging to society, the more it favors it as that which it simultaneously destroys. The prohibition of incest reflects the contradictory nature of the family itself. Where there is only family, where social institutions are nothing but extensions of clan, gang or estate structures, there is at the same time no family at all, because under these circumstances the family cannot develop as a specific social form and is constantly in the process of destroying its own foundations. Only when the family is constituted as a part of society that is withdrawn from and contradicts the private sphere, i.e., in the course of the development of the bourgeois society of exchange in commodities, does it gain independence, precisely because the society in which it is formed contains it and sets limits for it. This explains the fact that the incest taboo, although the foundation of civilization and a decisive constitutive element of society long before the emergence of bourgeois societies, only becomes the subject of reflection and conceptualization with the development of the bourgeois society of exchange, first in ethnology and later, and particularly fundamentally, in psychoanalysis. It is precisely in this retroactive reflection, as it were, that its universalist content asserts itself, the indissoluble interweaving of the history of civilization and humanity. Individual pleasure, the fulfillment of which is protected by the principle of sexual self-determination without coercion, is therefore only brought forth by the prohibition of incest as something conceivable in the first place, as the subject's pleasure in freely chosen sensual devotion to people who do not belong to his own stable and are therefore his equals. The economic significance that the incest commandment plays as an exogamy commandment in the transformation of clan, estate structures and other communities in society is inseparably linked to this psychosocial significance. It is not the primary purpose of the prohibition, because civilization is not absorbed in the economic conditions from which it arises. The ethnologically, socio-psychologically and politically disguised resentment against the validity of the incest taboo has consequently developed in parallel with the process of the bad sublation of the family. While the ethnologist Marcel Mauss, who was gladly taken into service by post-structuralism, examined the prohibition of incest and its various forms of mediation from taboo to codified law in the tradition of older ethnology, which saw itself as a contribution to the history of civilization, in terms of its significance in the history of mankind, Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his study The Elementary Structures of Kinship, first published in 1947, saw it only as a structure valid in various forms, but not constituting civilization, the general validity of which could at best be described but not interpreted in terms of human history. Post-structuralist overcomers of structuralism, such as Jacques Derrida and, particularly influentially, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in 1972 in Anti-Oedipus, who took offense at the scientific ethos that was still able to keep the relativist illusion of the structuralists under control in a positivist manner, drag Lévi-Strauss of logocentrism and celebrate the undermining of the elementary structures of kinship through incest, which occupies all familial positions multiple times and subverts the psychosocial, economic, and institutional preconditions of bourgeois socialization as a revolutionary process. To trace the history of the relativization of the prohibition of incest in ethnology and psychoanalysis in connection with the academic triumph of post-colonialism would go too far here. The correspondences between the theoretical historical development and the real historical transformation of the bourgeois family are at least obvious, while Lévi-Strauss' diagnosis, which explicitly understood itself as a countermodel to the hubris of Norbert Elias' process of civilization written in exile during National Socialism, was a soberly courageous statement of the ineluctability of barbarism in the face of the recently passed, Deleuze and Guattari's apology of schizo-incest. Functioned as an accompaniment to the authoritarian revolt of post-fascist youth against dad, mom and the nuclear family as incarnations of bourgeois ossification. In contrast, the most recent discussions about the incest ban, which have remarkably little of this former revolutionary pathos, can be interpreted as attempts to reorganize the remaining fragments of the destroyed bourgeois family, which must be got rid of and at the same time preserved in order to ensure social reproduction, by exorcising the civilizing content of the incest taboo as well as the legitimate longing that finds expression in incest as a social escape fantasy. Both are to be exorcised together, because both belong together. For incest is, as the statements of affected couples compiled by the Ethics Council show, as well as fictions such as Ian McEwan's The Cement Garden, inseparable from an antisocial, but not simply antisocial fantasy, even where it is not merely imagined, to find the one person with whom one can hide from the world, just as children build a cave together in order to draw a magic circle that banishes the diffuse fear of adults. A fear in which the child is made to realize without comprehension that everything that exists is wrong, that life is a horror and that joy, happiness and reconciliation are fantasies for which one must be ashamed in front of mature people. Every individual love repeats this magic circle in an unrepeatable way, known to no one but two, which is why there are pet names, stories, inventions and ridiculous hopes into which, in a society completely under the spell of myth, people's mimetic abilities conjuring, seduction, allurement, have retreated in place of the empty schemes of communicative reason. This longing lives on even in the most fleeting love, and therein lies its fundamental negativity, and the more intolerant individuals, even those who experience it themselves, react to this longing, the fewer loopholes remain for the intimate, while the public world is disempowered by semi-conscious, narrow-mindedly subjective needs and obsessions, the more contemptible this dream is made. In the fantasy of incest, it accumulates, as it were, by projecting onto the origin what could only be redeemed by stepping out of it, through freely chosen connection with other free people. By exorcising this commandment to connect with others, which is nothing other than the facilitation of unregulated experience, together with the negative impulse of the incest fantasy in the name of self-transparent and equal sexual intercourse participants negotiating with each other, the longing to withdraw from the world is liquidated together with the longing to go out into the world. Taken seriously, both aim at the same truth, which, if it were real, would no longer know any family or law, any origin or prohibition. Unconditional love is a sister to independent thinking. But who trusts their thoughts so much that they would follow them into the darkness and allow themselves to be led by them like a dancer who, after a daring leap, allows their partner to catch them again in a tight dance. The double meaning of the term recognize, which in the Bible also means to consummate sexual intercourse, is hardly known anymore. It is not only the postmodern ideologues of gender studies who are working to put an end to the passion that unites thinking and loving. Since the 1990s, the destruction of sex as the basis of thought has been popularized in the USA under the label of polyamory as a practical life aid and is finding more and more friends in all Western societies. Polyamory promises a way out of monogamy without the hiding games, suspicions and jealousy familiar from so-called open relationships. The trick: all sexual partners know each other personally, report to each other about intimacies that have taken place and talk together about any difficulties that arise. Friends of polyamory do not want to be lumped together with friends of swingers clubs or one-night stands. They strive for deep feelings, genuine love, responsibility and respect. They are committed to responsible non-monogamy, multiple love with respect, or responsible hedonism. They are still unorganized, and a network structure is also more suited to polyamory, says one of the active promoters of the new doctrine in an interview, before adding, "At some point there will be an association, and it will be in Germany first, Schroeder." Actually, it is only logical that in Germany of all places, which is also the land of clumsy lovers and charmless women, Wolfgangport, where the first thing that comes to mind in terms of sexual liberation is beat as erotic accessories trade for marital hygiene, and the Kommunard Rainer Langhans, and the members of private partnership rings want to found an umbrella organization. A commitment to responsibility and respect virtually cries out for appropriate care in an association under civil law. In Germany, polyamory is mainly discussed in left-wing and left-liberal publications, whose authors refer to a few standard works, such as Jungle World author Oliver Schatz, in praise of open relationships, which was recently presented at the Berlin Left Book Days. But there is also interest in the queer feminist, radical left-wing scene, and in Phase 2. Polyamory is in, and above all, green. It is the ecological recycling of the emotional world and works like renewable energy. If the old bond dies, you can find strength in a new one. If this also no longer provides warmth, you can reconnect to the old one, which is now recharged. You never have to fear loss, you never have to leave someone yourself. Many people opt for this type of relationship because they don't want to give up a beloved partner just because they slept with someone else, says Julia Seliger, formerly on the party council of Bündnis 90/Die Grünen. Polyamory is particularly at home where the denial of inner, sexual nature and the fetishization of outer nature is elevated to a principle. Polyamory is just as suitable for androgynous queer autonomists and friends of the emotionally hardcore, emos, as it is for studiosus Germans who, in their Jack Wolfskin clothing, no longer know which gender they are. You can meet such people in the Homeland Security Initiative against tourists in Kreuzberg or in the climbing gym, where they experience a little bit of lost nature, the contradictions of which they would rather not know about themselves. Polyamory promises to remedy the shortcomings of the relationship between two people. No more jealousy, no more lies about cheating, and no more boredom. But despite these promises, there are always frustrations in the love network that were thought to have been overcome. Quote, moreover, polyamory, i.e. the confession of cheating, does not seem to kill off the desire to maintain secret love relationships. Robin Trask found out that her husband, one of the 3 men with whom she maintains a love network, had been in a long-distance relationship with a friend for several months. The usual followed: denials, investigations, the discovery of cell phone bills, a confession. The couple have now been separated for some time and have divorce plans. End quote. Jealousy also remains a constant theme. Quote, and of course there are arguments related to the fact that 3 people are in a romantic relationship, especially when one of the 2 men doesn't think he has enough time alone with Franziska. End quote. In addition, the level of communication and organization increases immeasurably. So what is so attractive about polyamory? Never being alone again, being free from the fear of loss and thus the pitfalls of individuation, is the polyamorous promise. Everything happens in cliques and rackets, in the swarm of friends, Seliger, the gated community, Schroeder, in a collective. It is no coincidence that we fall for the child that we want to remain. Children could best be brought up in housing projects committed to polyamory, because there a backing similar to that of the clan could be developed, which requires support, especially in the question of a safe space for children. In the clan, with whose backing everything succeeds, things are like in the Green Party, with partnership contracts, rotation principle and firmly agreed veto rights. The skills taught at Loving More conferences also include keeping a strict calendar. The typical polyamory supporter seems to be a practical, rather sober person. For him, polyamory is a sensible relationship model, shot, and therefore a gain in freedom. Who wouldn't want that? Even insurance policies are taken out today for these reasons. In other respects, too, it seems to be less about sex and more about a new working model for part-time workers. We are dealing with a rational model that is suitable for optimally structuring and realistically assessing relationships. Even the problem of jealousy can be worked on and grown, Schroeder/Vetter, in order to move on to the serious work of emancipation after successfully overcoming a dark feeling, Schott. As one polyamory supporter puts it almost threateningly, we will work our way through our feelings. The work on relationships that is understood by polyamory continues the decentralization and demystification of the world begun by Protestantism, the destruction of the last secularized sacred, the arcanum that surrounds love, and of eros as an inward becoming of the specifically divine in man. Quote, "This love could end up like God." Even if it is still constantly sung about in pop songs, literature and cinema, the parallels are striking. Just as people once paid homage to the Holy Spirit in stained glass windows, oratories and frescoes, the belief in love could one day evaporate just as easily as Christianity, UFOs or any hope of life after death. End quote. Where things are practical instead of passionate, collective instead of individual, political instead of private, where there is work instead of enjoyment, it is no longer possible to hide the fact that sexuality, devotion and lust, unless you want to abolish them completely, are only permitted within very narrow limits. Polyamory puts an end to passions, especially stupid jealousy. Where it is boldly labeled sexual politics, there is above all the communal public negotiation of sexual misery, which makes the individual aware of his interchangeability without any consideration. The once feared, hated and above all distant rival, who can no longer be called a rival, now becomes the roommate in the shared flat or perhaps the best friend. You know all about your partner's preferences and qualities in bed and on the edge of the bed thanks to the relentless absolute honesty, an apparently pleasing form of self-discipline, and you also find out why the other person is so much more desirable than you are. Polyamorous people may talk about their feelings for hours and days on end, but they don't want to be carried away by them. The polyamory catechisms are as neurotic as Beta's specialist store for marital hygiene, clean, pure, and completely passionless in terms of language alone. The fact that the polyamory world is quite authoritarian is shown by the way it deals with jealousy. Almost every author of the movement opens this topic with a hymn to freedom, only to open each paragraph a few pages later with the word must. Quote, "When jealousy taps you on the shoulder, your first response must always be to acknowledge it and thank it for this opportunity for growth." End quote. Cornelia Johnson, the author of 111 Reasons to Love Openly, a song of praise for open relationships, polyamory and friendship, says, "Everyone involved must constantly communicate and formulate their needs in order for it to work." End quote. And Oliver Schott postulates, "If we want to become better people through love, then we have to start here." End quote. In workshops, you learn how to become completely free of jealousy and how to turn the pain of loss into empathy and joy with others. They rob knowledge of its basis in experience, want to find something okay in contrast to what has been learned, Maschewski, and praise self-transformation as the guiding motif of polyamorous practice. Where the self is to be changed and no longer the conditions under which the tortured creature lives, it becomes totalitarian. The ultimate consequence is the renunciation of love and romance, and the expulsion of the last spark of love that is still contained in polyamory. For it to work, you should no longer say "I love you," author collective of Aberdyke Gib DS ner Einmal für Michigan, and ultimately no longer have sex at all, because physical cohabitation, i.e. the same bedrooms and sex, makes closeness and love more difficult. As long as the usual partner does not want and love the new one exclusively, unconditionally, devotedly, lavishly, voluptuously, uniquely, uninhibitedly and therefore truly, and only gives him a version of love as affection that is just as worn out as the one you receive yourself, you allow him to connect with someone else. Where devotion is no longer wanted, everything is talked down until there is almost no passion left. This can be quite painful, but in the end very useful, because sex is just the icing on the cake itself consists of serious communication, shot. Polyamory contradicts exclusivity in love, regardless of whether it is a permanent relationship between two people or a short affair. Although the criticism is seemingly only aimed at exclusivity, this has long since come to mean that where nothing is exclusive, nothing should be dear to you. The secret of polyamory is mediocrity, in which there are no more extremes, no more abandonment, no jealousy scenes, but also no unconditionality, no devotion and no intimacy. Where sexuality degenerates into a glaze, it becomes clear that the left-wing commune guru No. 1, Rainer Langhans, has only expressed where the journey is heading: no more sex. Although polyamory distances itself from experiments with free sexuality, the fact that its most prominent advocate has become a polyamory supporter himself is not something that people like to talk about. Although we share Langhans' desire to have no more privacy, the asexual consequence inherent in the convert, his frightened instinct is nevertheless uncanny. But in the language of many polyamory authors, a sexual defense emerges that is not at all dissimilar to that of Rainer Langhans. They play down the sexual act as a more or less brutal rubbing of genitals, shot, or resort to infantile language, such as the authors of the brochure Aber Dyke gibt's nur einmal für Michigan, who introduced the German verb korpern. They unflinchingly claim that sexuality is only good if love is involved. In reality, love to them means taking care of each other, which is why little more than cuddling seems to be their correct physical realization. Quote, "But we're not swingers, we're not out for quick sex, we're there for each other, we each take care of the other." End quote. There is little time for eroticism and lovemaking, because polyamory means always being organized, planning a lot, renouncing spontaneity. There is neither room for secrets nor for the unforeseen. Every step must be considered in advance and evaluated afterwards. End quote. Sex is imagined as clean and not dirty, depraved, indecent, filthy and sinful. Passion and desire disappear in everyday life in such relationships, which functioned more like friendships and make way for brotherly love. The precise organization, the sleeping schedules and precisely defined areas of responsibility not only lead to a sexual low tide, they no longer have time for anything else. Quote, "I myself have decided that I want to have so much time for it. That's one of the reasons why I can never seriously do paid work." Maschewski. As in the great Islamic jihad of the heart, they are dogged fighters against their own ego, against the instinctual soul, with whose apologists they share a hatred of exclusivity. Langhans, who lives in similarly poor and isolated circumstances, also speaks out in favor of terror against the ego, for which one does not have to travel to the Orient. In 2007, he invited the former terrorist Brigitte Monhaupt to his harem. Quote, "After so long in prison, she certainly has needs, including sexuality. But for us it's about much more. Those who are prepared to do intensive relationship work, which can also be a form of terror, will experience the paradise of tomorrow." End quote. In praise of the internet as a global experience of ecstasy, as a living commune of today, in which there is friendship and love, Langhans attempts to define his paradise. The net is more spiritual than the materialism of the past, especially that of the West. For the first time in known human history, this net enables everyone to become spiritual beings. End quote. This virtual paradise no longer recognizes material people. The body appears only as a shell that contains the imperfect and impure, i.e. capitalism. Quote, "In reality, the infinitely diverse abundance of the net has long since abandoned capitalism, the effective distribution system of eternal scarcity. And not only it remains in the body. That is its characteristic." End quote. Perhaps such fantasies are one reason why most male authors of the polyamory movement are keen to appear unattractive so as not to be exposed to the usual accusation that polyamory is just a project to increase the frequency of copulation, the sexist determination of men as pick-up artists, Maschewski. The self-portrayal of a certain Mirko in a dating forum can only serve as a deterrent. He describes himself as not too cheerful and finds the appropriation of the wrong thing in itself sometimes quite emancipative. People are something incomprehensible to him. Sometimes he is overcome by an impotent feeling of torment, not being allowed to know what I want, but his brain is more gendered than that of others. Above all, polyamory criticizes the undeniable disintegration of relationships in monogamy into platonic and sexual parts. However, contrary to what the supporters of polyamory claim, the sexual relationship is much more likely to take place in the affairs they criticize, while the partnership, whether monogamous or polyamorous, often suffers from a lack of passion. Single people also have platonic friendships, but compensate for the lack of sexuality in them with changing affairs. He satisfies his physical needs separately, with a partner for bed, sexual organs, one who is humorous and intelligent for the brain, one who protects you to save your own skin, and finally the platonic friend who also listens. But this does not mean that the asocial, self-centered and dark side of Eros has suddenly broken through. Eros is simply no longer able to accomplish what it fervently demands, the individual historical detachment from goal-restrained, tender familial love, in order to sweep away the blood surges in a similar way to capital in the primitive accumulation phase and advance towards subjective happiness. Instead, it withers away. The individual maintains increasingly goal-bound, family-like relationships because the world seems alien and at the same time unattractive to him, and he does not see himself equipped for comparison with others in the competition. Instead of exogamy, the integration of more and more isolated people into the family circle becomes the guiding principle, in which people fight more than they get along and degrade themselves in platonic friendship to comrades, sports mates and flat-sharing communards, and in love to partners. As mutual confessors without sex and without the ecstasy of real priests in asceticism, they voluntarily endure this crude and deeply German relationship between the sexes, which has long since become universal. These brutalized relationships have long been dominated by what Langhans desires, namely unbearable, terroristic closeness without physical desire. But polyamory is not quite the opposite of monogamy. Polyamory joyfully embraces the decaying drive that powerlessly capitulates before the peaks instead of tearing open the sky, but is just as unable to create the true universal and takes revenge with brotherly love, the flip side of which, the sudden and indiscriminate rejection of drive, they prefer not to talk about. Monogamy, which has long since ceased to be romantic, has betrayed its very own idea of sharing erotic and platonic needs with one and the same person, and polygamy unites them more than their respective ideologues would admit. The ideal of love is forfeited where, according to Nietzsche, the degree and nature of a person's sexuality is kept away from the ultimate summit of his spirit. But where one's own closeness to the pitfalls of bourgeois monogamy is concealed, all that remains for the mind is blind rage against its father, the desire for exclusivity. Quote, such an ideal of love is not only a great challenge for people, it is often an excessive demand. Reasons for divorce and mental illness caused by this challenge prove this fact, Schroeder/Vetter. The real reason for psychological suffering is not the ideal of love, but the opposite, the end of sensuality, whether in monogamy or polygamy. The separation from sensual perception and from the perception of the human being as a sensual supersensual thing is followed by the famous circling of thoughts that accompanies almost every mental illness, thoughts that are purified of all matter and become insane in themselves. Not unlike communism, love is not a movement of the spirit following the will, but because it springs from physical desire, a rebellion of the flesh, a real movement. This anarchic rebellion of love is not only its objection to a polyamory movement which, as a liberation of love, pursues its entanglement in schedules and sets of rules. It is also her veto against bourgeois marriage. Love does not behave as a reasonable or socially acceptable emotional impulse, but as an asocial expression of life by lovers against their environment, which the polyamory movement wants to abolish and soften bourgeois sexual morality in marriage. And yet, in the emphasis on the asociality of love, the notion remains that its increasingly rare and increasingly fragile tendency towards marriage and long-term relationships not only creates coercion, but in this exclusive togetherness designed for the long term, the intimate desire for liberation in which the relationship of the particular to the general is preserved. For where polyamory seeks to liberate love from its urge for exclusivity, the compulsion to compete increases to infinity and builds up an overmanaged world in which not only is liberation no longer possible, but at the same time the idea of another world is no longer even permitted. The successive establishment of second and third relationships is no different to the run-up to the real separation of a couple with all the relationship discussions, promises and new beginnings on trial. However, while there is a breakup at some point and usually too late, polyamory prevents the final decision and suspends a couple's crisis. Not only does this perpetuate the bond between the former lovers, this suspension of the past affects everyone who comes into contact with the two and is gripped by their coldness and lack of love, which is then called tolerance and understanding. Polyamory draws intimacy out into the open and sprays a poison that, unlike the termination of a relationship, where the most disgusting misconduct and hostility between the former lovers can occur, perpetuates the separation as a condition as a compulsion to communicate, to continue, i.e. to perpetuate the misery. In this way, a permanent crisis is conjured up that can only be maintained by a myriad of rules and agreements. Certainly, the permanent crisis in polyamory cannot be completely separated from the crises in monogamous relationships. But where in monogamy it seems as if crises can always repel something old, something from the past, because the possibility of rupture is constitutive, the polyamorous person no longer gives in to the illusion that they can detach themselves from anything and becomes one with the past that always determines the present because of the past but never leaving relationship partners. In contrast to swingers, for whom the temporary change of sexual partners is certainly a solution to temporary crises, and the unpopular singles, who do not care about the feelings of their partners beyond the night they spend together. Lived polyamory demands full control of emotions through all-round transparency, and bundles frustration against the common enemy, so-called serial monogamy. While in this form, all beauty must prove to be poison when it comes to separation, with the probable consequence that attraction before and disgust after the break become increasingly powerless the next time, the followers of polyamory completely deny the specialness inherent in exclusivity and completely surrender it to the false generality. Polyamory is the theory of an unconsciously litigating general that gloats over the disintegration of marriage, as one of the last possibilities of forming human cells in the inhuman general Adorno, and sneeringly states that it too cannot realize the true general. As the individual's cynical awareness of their private misfortune, polyamory makes itself the custodian of an inhumanity that joyfully affirms hopelessness as a seemingly unquestionable compulsion. If polyamory were to become total, everything would dissolve into communication, into an endless confusion of voices. If intimacy, which is reminiscent of secrecy as well as unspoken agreement, were to disappear as the last objection to language that has degenerated into communication, if communication were allowed to penetrate to the furthest corners of sexuality, then it would become total and the drive would be brought to a standstill. People would still be able to walk and eat, but they would be the living dead. What Uschi Obermeier said polemically about her ex-boyfriend Rainer Langhans would become true: he's been at a standstill for 40 years. He somehow got stuck back then. Rainer hasn't moved on since 68. On the contrary, he's a sad, pathetic joke. A boring caricature of himself. He continues, he just talks, he doesn't live. He's embarrassing, has no emotions at all, and is the most humorless person I know. This pseudo-harem in Munich with these 4 women is also just horrible. They've been going all super spiritual, total expansion of consciousness, blah blah blah, drinking tea and eating tofu for decades. It really makes my skin crawl. Because the truth is they're just fighting, jealous and envious of each other. End quote. Certainly, the love of the sexes always remains ambivalent as the reason for dreams, inventions, challenges and ideas, but also misconceptions, wars, violence and the reason for the financial ruin of entire families. But the humane is formed as a sense of difference in its most powerful experience, that of the sexes, Adorno. The gender contradiction has become total in the exchange society and is most bitterly manifested in it. Yet this contradiction must be endured and not abolished in the death of sensuality if we do not want to abolish the possibility of one day casting off the society that mediates it. So that the reconciliation contained in the reconciliation of the sexes may appear in a united humanity, and that in intercourse, as an act of sex and exchange, truly equal things may finally be exchanged. The fact that such reconciliation is conceivable at all is due to exclusive love, which does not want to concern itself with others, which no longer knows any society or abstract life, and is thus the appearance of a world that no longer needs gender antagonism. When the Frankfurt publisher Mars Verlag published the book Sex Front in 1970, written by the social scientist Gunter Amment together with the comic artist Alfred von Meisenbug, which was intended to provide sex education for young people regardless of the moral and political views of the ministries of education and the Christian churches, numerous institutions and individuals immediately called for the book to be indexed. The Federal Review Board for Publications Harmful to Young Persons rejected the application for indexing, citing, among other things, the book's high sexual hygienic information content, which distinguished it from the Christian-motivated attempts to educate young people that were still widespread at the time. In 1971, the educationalist Friedrich Koch made a similar, albeit more polemical, assessment of the book, saying that its ethical approach went further than many an individualistic elitist concept of clerical provenance. Quote, after all, it is difficult to imagine that a reader would fall into obsessive brooding and suicidal tendencies after reading this book, which does not always seem sufficiently guaranteed after indoctrination by church-oriented authors. End quote. Koch thus emphasized what was really new about Sex Front. Apart from the renunciation of moralism and monogamy propaganda, it was not held in the uptight and preachy tone of previous sex education, but was carried by an optimistic, life-affirming and unashamed tone, which gave the plea for curiosity and against self-imposed fear, which Amment formulated, the appropriate form. For Mars Verlag, whose director Georg Schroeder had decided to bring the volume onto the market at the very reasonable price of 5 marks despite fears of making losses as a result, Sex Front proved to be an unexpectedly great success. By 1973, 150,000 copies of the book had been sold. After the takeover by Zweite Zendundians in 1978 and since 1982 under license from Rowohlt, the success was repeated. Today the book is one of the few sex education longsellers. In the field of sexual politics, It thus marks the transfer of ways of thinking and living from the alternative culture of the 68 to the culturally and socio-politically modernized Federal Republic. Arend, who as a student was a member of the SDS and later of the DKP and in the 1970s, in addition to his work for the Hamburg Institute for Sexual Research, dealt with the drug use of young people and the reception of American popular culture by the Federal Republic of Germany, was predestined for such a transfer between the former counterculture and the future mainstream. Von Meysenbug, who worked as an illustrator, had also come to the West German rock and pop art scene from the 68 movement. The much older Schroeder, on the other hand, had published Victor Klemperer's LTI in the 1960s as head of the Darmstadt-based Melzer publishing house alongside authors of US Beat literature, before establishing a pedagogical program at Mars Verlag, founded in 1969, which published contemporary texts on anti-authoritarian education as well as historical writings such as those by Siegfried Bernfeld and Otto Ruhl, which had previously been difficult to obtain. In retrospect, the hatred that Sexfront was met with from conservative circles, especially the churches and Christian parties, seems to indicate that the book was exactly in tune with the times. This can be seen in three tendencies that run through the volume: the conviction that sex education was torpedoed by young people swearing allegiance to marriage as a private goal in life and therefore had to dispense with moral instruction, the focus on young people as a special target group, who were seen as having independent needs that could not be measured against the adult world, and finally the desensitization of the diction, which was itself pragmatic, namely based on sex education, enriched with elements of youth language and accompanied by a different form of illustration, using comics instead of anatomical images. The subjectivization and deconventionalization of sex education, which can be seen in these tendencies, indicate the still progressive impulse of Sexfront, as well as its limits. Turning away from monogamous marriage as the ultimate purpose of sex education meant that Sexfront was the first to deal in detail with everything that became standard in sex education in the 1980s, the variety of contraceptive methods, petting, masturbation, foreplay, the use of sex toys and other aids. All of this was no longer coyly discussed as a side issue of the sexual act aimed at procreation, but as a plea for its independence. In general, with the move away from marriage as a sexual reproductive community, sexuality as an end in itself rather than just a means became the focus of sexual education. As the most important period of this experience, adolescence took on a new significance as a developmental phase. While the previous sex education books appealed to youth as a time of immaturity that was to be overcome through sexual hygiene including moral instruction, immaturity was discovered as a specific quality of experience in Sexfront. Sexual hygiene information and instruction was replaced by experimentation as a new form of sexual experience. Information about biology, anatomy, the somatic foundations of pleasure, etc., was not pushed back as a result, but was given a new place, which it later retained even in popular cultural formats such as the earlier founded Bravo, which, despite its greater conventionalism, is in many respects in the tradition of Arendt's book. While sex education books up until the publication of Sexfront, and for a long time afterwards mostly had the character of explanatory instructions for the subsequent act, the information and empiricism in Sexfront were immediately linked to the sexual experiment that did not follow them, but in which they themselves existed. The media forms Arend and Meysenbug chose for this were the pictorial narrative and the comic, which also later became a mass cultural format through Bravo. While a factual, emotionally uninvolved text accompanied anatomical illustrations in the Sexology Handbook, the biological and anatomical information in Sexfront was embedded in emotionally highly vivid tableaus. This was not simply a subjectivization, but also a new objectivity. The book's comics put an end to the unworldly assumption that sexuality can be fixed and neutralized, as it were, by natural science, regardless of the forms in which it is experienced. Rather, it was part of the principle of Sexfront to understand subjective experience, including tabooed feelings such as disgust, fearful ambivalence, happy powerlessness, as an objective constitution of sexuality itself. In 1979, the small Darmstadt-based Weltkreis Verlag published Arendt's Das Sexbuch, which could be seen as a follow-up to Sexfront. 17 years later, it was also republished by Rowohlt. By this time, Arend had long since shifted the focus of his work on the sociology of youth from sexual politics to drug politics. LSD had become a popular youth drug in the United States since the 1970s in the wake of the hippie movement, and the supposed danger to young people through addiction had replaced the fear of the subversive effects of the sexual revolution in terms of mass appeal in the 1980s, right down to popular TV crime series such as Ein Fall für Zwei or Soko 5113 in West Germany. The fact that sex education formats, such as Arend had established with Sexfront, have since become increasingly popular in normal school lessons and have hardly provoked any political or public, sometimes only clerical opposition, was primarily a result of the everydayization of seemingly offensive sexuality, which was also stripped of its cultural revolutionary implications with its integration into everyday culture. Although Sexfront is still challenging to read in detail, especially in its explicit and detailed depiction of the fears associated with sexuality and fantasies considered perverse, the critical pathos with which Ament and Meisenbug confronted the prudery of the time seems rather cute today. Ex negativo, the harmlessness of Ament's books on sex education today shows how far removed the revolutionary hope for the liberation of sexuality still widespread in the 60s and 70s is from the current era, at least in Western countries. The sphere of intimacy, which in that brief period that Gerd Konen called the Red Decade was considered socially more important than gainful employment, university, education, and even the family by both supporters and enemies of sexual liberation, is today, on the contrary, the area in which people resign themselves particularly unopposed and particularly early, usually as early as adolescence itself. While even the most pointless drudgery in school, work, academia, and civic work appears to be an activity that somehow gets you ahead, love relationships, affairs, and even more so non-binding promiscuous contact have been robbed of any transcending hope, any fantasy and emphasis. This is probably one of the most important reasons why the West has so readily surrendered to Islam, the most anti-sexual and anti-life form of rule today. Those who can no longer explain to themselves where the intermittently recurring need to be intimate with other people in freedom comes from, despite all the coercion and misery, are no longer able to see the main enemy in those who would prefer to punish this need with death. Minors who want to discover their sexuality as both enticing and threatening, as both familiar and alien to their own, still childlike experience, instead of switching from their teenage room wallpapered with Christina Aguilera or Justin Bieber to the Protestant disinfected partner bed just in time for the onset of adulthood, are living dangerously. Not only are they exposed to the educational advice of relatives who want them to have a responsible relationship, and the ridicule of mature schoolmates who, like their dull-witted parents, have long since come to regard sex as a crude routine and the object not of sacred seriousness but of silly jokes. They are also at risk of being registered as criminals by the Federal Criminal Police Office, BKA. This was the experience of a 14-year-old boy in Thuringia in 2011 who left a hickey on the neck of a 13-year-old girl. The girl's parents reported him for child abuse after discovering traces of the assault on their flesh and blood. In the same year, the Arnstadt Juvenile Court found the boy guilty of actually having caused a clearly visible hickey, and also touching the girl's clothed genitals. He was sentenced to 60 hours of community service for sexual abuse of children. 4 months later, the Erfurt District Court demanded a DNA sample from him so that he could be included in the BKA's gene file of offenders at risk of reoffending. An appeal was lodged against this. In 2012, the Federal Constitutional Court issued a temporary injunction stating that no such sample could be requested from the boy until further notice, as this could result in irreparable stigmatization. The boy has nevertheless committed an offense. According to the German Criminal Code (StGB), any sexual contact between a person over the age of 14, i.e. of criminal age, and a child under the age of 14 is a criminal offense in Germany, regardless of whether the child has previously consented to the sexual act. Adults face up to 10 years in prison for this offense. When it comes to defining the offense, the committed public is even more generous than the judiciary, as shown by last summer's scandalous case of the Hertha Lolita, a then 16-year-old who claimed in a cover story in the Berlin tabloid BZ on August 22, 2013 that she had had consensual sex with various players of the club in her children's room. They had previously approached her at an autograph session and given her their cell phone numbers. She has since recanted her statements, declared that she was in fact still a virgin, and reported herself to the police because she had forged her parents' signature on the consent form for the publication of the report in the BZ. The BZ therefore now wants to take the case to court. However, public and private opinion had reached its verdict much earlier. The Hertha players were already regarded as sex monsters worthy of condemnation, if not legally, then morally, immediately after the publication of the scandal story, and the girl, precisely because she is not just a child but a Lolita, as being either a child or neglected. If the events were merely the product of the 16-year-old's imagination, this is unlikely to change the moral judgment of civil society, which always considers bad thoughts to be just as despicable as bad deeds. Nobody is interested in what impulses, fears, prejudices, and desires may have motivated the young woman to talk about sexual encounters with sportsmen who, according to her disclosure report, were sensitive and married, and yet had no guilty conscience during sex with her. What adult men find provocative about schoolgirls, whether something happened in Hertha's case or not, and whether such a desire is not at least understandable in view of the overwhelming stupidity and wasteland of the real adult world, these questions were not asked then or now. At the time, the committed citizens had once again discovered their responsibility for their apparently a priori helpless, mindless and sexless offspring, towards whom every sexual impulse was basically somehow abusive and violent from the outset. Not only had the discovery of various cases of abuse in the Catholic Church, in reformist educational institutions, in schools and homes since 2010 led to a revival of the discussion about the alleged mass occurrence of child abuse in Germany, which had been conducted with a zeal for persecution in the early 1990s. In addition, the German criminal law on sexual offenses had already been tightened in previous years, not least due to the omnipresent danger of child pornography on the internet. The age limit up to which minors can be named as potential victims of pornography and abuse offenses has been raised since the 1990s, which stands in remarkable contrast to the findings of various Shell and other youth studies in recent decades that young people in Germany are having their first sexual experiences earlier and earlier on average, which says nothing about the way in which these experiences are processed and reflected upon. A look at the various versions of the StGB shows that the eradication of the moral jargon that characterized sexual criminal legislation until the 1960s in no way reflects the liberalization of criminal law in this area, but rather conceals its continued, in some cases even greater rigidity. The prevailing sexual morality is not, as in earlier versions of the legal text, rhetorically dragged along while it is de facto legally liberalized, but rather, at least with regard to child and adolescent sexuality, it is executed without explicit moral evaluation through the mere form of the legislation, possibly more strictly than before. The criminal law on sexual offenses codified in the Criminal Code of 1958, which still uses the term incest and the term fornication, including between men, which deliberately blurs the boundaries between abuse, rape, and socially inappropriate sexuality, defines the offense of seduction in Section 182 as follows. Anyone who seduces a blameless girl who has not reached the age of 16 to have sexual intercourse shall be punished with imprisonment for up to 1 year. End of quote. Almost 30 years later, in the 1985 version of the same paragraph, the seemingly anachronistic attribute blameless, which seems to involuntarily even morally exonerate shamed, somehow destroyed or prematurely mature girls of the same age, was dropped. Instead of a prison sentence, a fine is now also possible, and for offenders under the age of 21, the possibility of refraining from punishment is expressly stated. In the 1998 version, the same paragraph no longer defines the offense as seduction, but as sexual abuse of minors, and specifies it as follows: a person over the age of 18 who abuses a person under the age of 16 by 1. Performing sexual acts on them, by taking advantage of a predicament or in return for payment, or 2. Causing them to perform sexual acts on a third party or having a third party perform sexual acts on them by taking advantage of the predicament shall be punished by imprisonment for up to 5 years or a fine. End quote. Exploitation of the victim's lack of capacity for sexual self-determination is explicitly cited as a reason for punishment. The current version of the StGB, which also contains the aforementioned passage, also includes a new criminal offense in Section 184C, distribution, acquisition and possession of juvenile pornographic material, which supplements the provisions on child pornography. In contrast to the moralizing talk of enticement to sexual intercourse, the provision's sexual abuse of minors initially appears to have selectivity and neutrality. However, if one takes into account that everything from blackmail and coercion to the instrumentalization of social hierarchies and economic dependency to the mere existence of a large age difference can be interpreted as exploitation of a predicament, and that, regardless of the consent of the underage victim, a criminal complaint by a parent or guardian may be sufficient for prosecution. This is less a concretization of the indeed problematic concept of seduction than a softening of the concept of abuse. Equally dubious is the talk of exploiting the victim's lack of capacity for sexual self-determination with regard to young people under the age of 16. The fact that sexuality and so-called self-determination are always, even in adults, in a contradictory relationship that must be constantly reflected upon and dealt with anew by the individual may not be of great legal importance. However, linking the criterion of sexual self-determination to a supposedly objectively valid age limit is questionable. Finally, by supplementing the provisions on child pornography with those on youth pornography, the boundary between children and adolescents is blurred in the name of protecting minors, which in reality childizes young people and tends to bring all pornography back into the vicinity of a criminal offense. Legal and moral aspects thus remain intertwined here too, even if this is no longer immediately clear in the wording of the law. Objectively, this legislation punishes less the violation of the physical and mental integrity of the child, who is in fact in need of protection against violence by adults, than any reference to the apparently highly anxiety-ridden ambiguity of the boundary between child and adult, which cannot be eliminated by legal definitions, nothing other than the transition between the two, in its socially accepted form, is referred to as youth. In other words, the memory that the child who is not yet an adult is already the adult that he or she will one day become, just as, conversely, the child that he or she was, happy and unhappy, as a source of suffering and pleasure, is preserved in every adult. It is interesting to note that this memory is more strongly present in the older concept of seduction than in the concept of abuse, as seduction does not phenomenologically describe violence and coercion very precisely, and therefore probably does not clarify much in legal terms, but forms of persuasion, illusion and coquetry, of play, of deliberately false or untenable promises, in which moments of heteronomy and self-determination are necessarily mixed. Seductions in this sense are enticements that enable the fluid and precarious transition from childlike to adult sexuality, from the never merely helpless powerlessness of the child to the fragile adult self-determination, which in turn never completely escapes the spell of powerlessness under the given conditions. To describe someone as seducible is to concede to him or her the ability to be a victim as well as a perpetrator and to take into account the ambivalence of sex, if not legally, then at least morally. To describe someone exclusively as a potential victim of abuse is to deny ambivalence and not only to deny them the ability to make themselves the object of someone else's lust in order to increase their own pleasure, an ability without which sexual happiness is not possible, but also to deny the minor's ability to become not a victim but a promoter of their own and someone else's desire. If the word child protection has any positive meaning at all, then it is to rescue the capacity for sensual happiness inherent in every child and to bring it to a realization of itself, instead of stifling it at the very beginning of its genesis, so that the child's sexuality, which is inhibited before its development and subsequently fixed in infantile form, becomes the socially conformist, regressed adult character in name only. The rhetoric of abuse, which determines not only the current criminal law on sexual offenses, but even more so today's everyday sexual morality, is able to incriminate as violent even the voluntary act of giving oneself to another person, in which the self necessarily does not determine itself in a well-behaved and predictable way, but forgets itself in the other. Seduction, on the other hand, does not exclude heteronomy in its genuine sense, but it does exclude coercion. In it, devotion to the other is not suffered, but enjoyed, and unlike the Protestant ethics of thoroughly gendered anti-sexists, it knows no rigid codes that everyone just has to follow so that sexuality finally runs as smoothly as traffic regulated by the authorities. Such codes are replaced in seduction, as in politeness, coquetry, irony and related civilized forms of friendly or erotic exchange, by rules of the game that serve the cause rather than ethics and guarantee their own success just as little as they make the future predictable. In the perhorrescence of seduction, as bigoted as it is, at least the fearful awareness of the power of the casually compelling game still resonates, without which all erotic tension would dry up and all sexual happiness would wither away. In the ethics of abuse prevention, this magic, where it has not died out anyway, is condemned from the outset and without regard to the matter as an ideologization of violence. Only in view of this change in sexual morality from the prevention of seduction to the prevention of abuse does the discussion about the pedophile past of the Greens become understandable. The fact that the reappraisal of the early pedophile history of the Greens is not determined by an effort to understand the historically repressed, but by an entirely contemporary delusion, is shown by the fact alone of how little new information even evil-minded commentators have been able to reveal about the party. From the studies published last spring by Göttingen political scientist Franz Walter on the apology of pedophilia in the Green Party, the bourgeois quality press and Christian democratic politicians, and shortly afterwards the left liberal public and the Taz newspaper, initially picked out the supposedly scandalous statements by Daniel Cohn-Bendit from his autobiography Der Grosse Basar, The Great Bazaar, as well as passages from Flasterstrand for which he was editorially responsible, in order to prove that the Greens had once played down pedophilia. Without exception, these were documents that had long been accessible to the public, had already been discussed in the Green milieu at the time of their creation, and were repeatedly used by political opponents for denunciatory purposes. The information about pedophile practices in the Indian commune founded in Heidelberg in 1972, which was scandalized by the media and demanded the abolition of all laws for the protection of minors, also came from known sources. As usual, all sorts of celebrities were found guilty of misconduct as a result of the months-long debate. Jürgen Tritten had signed a local election manifesto of the alternative list in Göttingen in 1981, which included a passage on the extensive impunity of pedophile acts, presumably contributed by the homosexual Action Göttingen. Volker Beck, parliamentary secretary of the parliamentary group of the Greens, had called for the decriminalization of pedosexuality in 1988 in an essay, which, contrary to his own admission, had hardly changed from the typescript in the printed version, with the FDP politician Dagmar Doring, who resigned as her party's Bundestag candidate last August as a consequence of her statements in favor of pedophilia at the time. Even a woman was temporarily targeted by the campaign, not unusual for the reality, but certainly for the public perception of pedophilia. Since then, The Taz in particular has made countless details from the history of left-wing alternative pedophilia available to interested amateur historians. As early as 1969, for example, a model educational project in West Berlin employed pedophiles with criminal records as caregivers for 12 to 14-year-old street children. In his reports at the time, the sexologist Helmut Kentler, founder of the project, enthused about the social benefits of the caregivers being involved for their boys not only for professional reasons, but also for reasons of sexual affection. Kentler, who died in 2008 and lived as an avowed homosexual with 3 adopted sons, is regarded as a pioneer of emancipatory youth education, is the author of several sex guides, and in 1988, assessed the former model project as a complete success in a scientific statement for the Berlin Senate Department for Family, Women and Youth. All quotes from the Taz of 14/15.9.2013. However, the justified criticism of Kentler's emancipatory youth education was tellingly taken by the Taz as an opportunity for completely different denunciations. According to Nina Appen and Astrid Geisler, the authors of the article, Kentler, as a guest author for Die Zeit, had already recommended to middle-class families in 1969 to loosen up on sex education at home and question the taboo that children should only see their parents naked under strictly regulated conditions. To reinforce their defamation of sexual looseness and the insinuation that sexual liberalization since the 1960s has opened the floodgates to child abuse, Appen and Geisler cite reformed accomplices such as the social pedagogue Manfred Kappeler, who was involved in the working group for critical home education in the 1960s and called for more radical youth education reforms than Kentler, but today finds the bickering of prominent Green politicians shameful in view of the pedophilia accusations, and smugly and ruefully point this out, that even the Taz newspaper praised Kentler in an obituary in 2008 as a meritorious fighter for a permissive sexual morality, and praised him for proving that sexuality does not have to be dirty, not even that between the generations. In their infamy, the author's remarks are quite accurate. The left-wing alternatives have truly not learned from their past that their efforts to liberate child sexuality have always been undertaken not in the name of future individuals, but, as it is correctly put, in the service of a permissive sexual morality, i.e. not in the name of freedom, but of pedagogy. Instead, they have learned that sexuality must be something somehow dirty. That they should not be ashamed of their authoritarian anti-authoritarianism, but of the not so few truly libertarian waste products of their emancipatory efforts. With the brazen conformism of class nerds, it is therefore assured, the Taz has repeatedly dealt with its own pedophile entanglements, and will continue to do so. End quote. To permanently deal with one's own entanglements means to be on the right side, not by criticizing the former efforts to liberate pedophilia as a form of false emancipation, which presupposes that childhood and adulthood are not only understood as different phases of development, but also as an experience that spans the empirical ages of life. But by drawing the line between childhood and adulthood even more rigidly than before and denying the residues of childlike sexuality in the adult as well as the still unconscious adult impulse in the sexuality of the child. Children and adults alike are thus confirmed as constitutional minors who, instead of having experiences, can only conduct negotiations. Those who demanded sex education in 1968 are now dodging around when it comes to the heart of the matter. How was sex negotiated between adults and children back then? The Taz article states with appropriate tough but fair rhetoric. The capacity for sexual self-determination, which is supposed to distinguish the adult from the still child, is defined by means of an ethics of negotiation that also reduces the concept of sex education to a question not of individual capacity for experience and reflection, but of the pedagogically measurable acquisition of competence, and which can think of moral judgments solely in terms of legal procedures, i.e. as the result of negotiations. To show too much looseness in sexual matters, to allow oneself to be entangled, to dilly-dally and to maneuver instead of getting straight to the heart of the matter, in the eyes of such anti-sexualism mongers who prefer a clear edge, this testifies to a lack of sexual competence and should be driven out of those who have gone astray as completely as possible with reappraisal and discourse therapy. When you read about the self-realization furor with which the right to have sex with children was agitated at the time, it leaves you speechless, Stefan Reinecke stated in the August 13, 2013 edition of the magazine, and asked the audience, how could people who were committed to human rights and emancipation tolerate this? How could they overlook the obvious power imbalance between adults and children? End quote. Elizabeth Raffoff also explained in the Taz on January 16, 2013, before the debate on the results of the Göttingen study, how this irresponsibility could be countered pedagogically. Quote, child protection organizations have long used slogans such as no means no, or you can say no to promote the children's no, without taking into account the fact that this is exactly what drives some children into a corner. Today, child protection has become much more cautious. The Oldenburg Child Protection Center, for example, formulates its concerns in a more differentiated way, that children should be better prepared so that they are better able to say no or run away or get help when adults or older people do things they want. The responsibility for sexual abuse lies solely with the adults. Even if children say yes to abusive situations or allegedly even actively participate, children do not have a free choice. They are always victims. There is no such thing as consensual sex with a 13-year-old, as Roman Polanski claimed for himself in 1977 when he lured a girl into a friend's villa, allegedly to photograph her. End quote. That the then 13-year-old Samantha Geimer, whom Polanski did not allegedly photograph for Vogue magazine, but demonstrably did, was already working as a model at the time of the incident and was no longer sexually inexperienced, that she expressed her regret during the trial about the proceedings instigated by her parents and has defended Polanski against his accusers to this day. All these well-known facts are irrelevant if childhood is defined in the spirit of black pedagogy as the stage of life in which one does not have free choice, if children are always victims and nothing can exist between them and adults other than a power imbalance. In contrast, a sound insight could begin with the realization that under the given conditions there is always some kind of power imbalance in adult sexual relationships, and that in happy cases this can even promote happiness through consideration and tenderness or by transforming the differences into constituents of erotic play, that with obdurate pride, so-called equal relationships, in which negotiation has long since replaced not only seduction but also conflict, and any mental end. Sensual tension has been successfully neutralized because the power imbalance has been replaced by consensual mutual empowerment of the self-determined sex partners. On the other hand, give the participants anything but an increase in freedom, that the difference between child and adult sexuality is not that adults are self-determined and children are victims, but is measured by the degree of ability to reflect on one's own lust and the lust of the other, which takes one as its object, and to transform the cluelessness, through which the child can actually become a victim, into the ability to reflect on devotion. To achieve this, it is not necessary, as Raffoff propagates, to make children stronger and teach them to say no in order to bring them into line with the armored creatures that anti-sexists encounter every day in their own milieu before they reach adulthood, but on the contrary, to allow the ability to experience objects, to experience the ego alien, to become reflexive, which is inherent in the child's experience, for the time being hazy and preconscious. Strengthening the ability to experience objects in this way does not replace the child's supposed weakness with a strength trained by sexual political coaches, but rather transforms it, fortunately, into the ability to freedom achieved through individuation, which is unthinkable without tolerating and loving recognition of weakness, both one's own and that of others. In place of such an awareness of the constitutional similarity between the child and the adult, who ultimately emerges from the latter, in place of the determination of the non-identical in the subject, which holds proximity in difference and difference in proximity. Both child protection and anti-sexism impose prohibitions that are intended to secure the boundary between childhood and adulthood and yet in reality make both spheres equal under the spell of the infantile fixed standard character, to which everyone has to conform. When Raffoff offers children the tautological slogan "no means no," relegates them to victim status and denies even the possibility that minors, i.e. future adults, could actually say yes to sexual desire, she is talking in exactly the same way as her anti-sexist colleagues, who speak not of children but of adults. Even children should learn the rules that adults use to keep each other at bay or go at each other instead of dealing with each other like adults, and which adults believe they need to survive as much as bicycle helmets and neon jackets, which they squeeze themselves into in traffic just like their children. It is therefore nothing more than a suggestion that the child protectionist campaigns against pedophilia are primarily concerned with young children who suffer violence. In other words, the manifestation of pedosexuality that everyone agrees should be outlawed anyway. In actual fact, the invocation of the helplessness of minors, which is as penetrating as it is vague, serves to install a sexual code of conduct that exorcises Freud's discovery of child sexuality by denying the child's right to its own sexuality with the argument that adults have no right to the child's sexuality and seeks to drive out not only children but all people's awareness of the unavailability of sex, which is not remembered as the first nature but is to be completely subjugated to the second in the name of self-determination and consensuality. The aim is not to strengthen children or sensitize adults, but to transform children and adults into equally unresponsive people. The exaggerated zeal with which adults hammer the pragmatic and sometimes useful warning, "Don't let strangers talk to you," into their children unconsciously echoes this need. The scandalization of alleged cases of pedophilia and abuse in recent years is also linked to a conspicuous lack of interest in the degree and type of damage actually caused, which is laboriously concealed by the ritualized diagnosis of unspecified traumas. Whether the snogged 13-year-old in Thuringia found the incriminated act shocking, unpleasant, embarrassing, or even shocking and therefore beautiful was of as little concern to the anti-sexist researchers as the motives for the Hertha Lolita's exposé, and no victim of the Green Communards has been found who would have given a vivid and evidence-based account of the long-term consequences of their terror, even though German communitarianism in toto has in fact always been a single abuse of the mind and senses. Instead of explaining why the communitarian leveling of generational boundaries, the denial of continuing hierarchies in the name of all-encompassing bonds of friendship, the systematic destruction of the private sphere, the confusion of promiscuity and concubinage, and the resentment against any form of erotic refinement in the communes were an expression of contempt for sexuality. Instead of interpreting the thoughtlessness in dealing with pedophilia as a symptom of grassroots organized sexual contempt, one comes up against precisely those actions and statements that point beyond communitarianism. One passage from a 1978 Flasterstrand article for which Cohn-Bendit was editorially responsible is repeatedly cited as scandalous. Last year, a 6-year-old comrade girl seduced me. It was one of the most beautiful and speechless experiences I've ever had. Perhaps it was so beautiful because it was so speechless. But I couldn't stand this speechlessness again and couldn't relate to her afterwards. End of quote. The text published by Dagmar Doring in 1980 in the anthology Pädophilie Hoot, which led to her resignation and prompted the Bild newspaper to exclaim in bewilderment, "Who writes something like that?" contains the following description of the sexual experience with a 9-year-old. Quote, "She finally sat down on my lap herself, spoke very sweetly, and also expressed her sexual desires. I was stunned by her, so in love with her manner, her looks, her emotions." End of quote. What is striking about these statements, which do not describe sexual acts and certainly not acts of violence, but rather sexual experiences saturated with fantasy, is not only their reflexive character, i.e., the ability to perceive the reported actions in their contradictory and questionable nature, but above all the truly scandalous fact for anti-sexist communication policemen that in the situations described, it is not the children but the adults who figure as powerless, as stunned and speechless, and that this powerlessness is what constitutes the sexual happiness to which they bear witness in the first place. The fact that it is the adults who are seduced by the child, who allow themselves to be sweetly approached by it, who are in love with the child and are speechless and helpless in the face of this experience, may be fed more by imaginary impulses than by the real relationship constellation, and there is no doubt that the confusion of fantasy with reality, which imputes the children's own unacknowledged desire as an intention, is the decisive problem of all pedophilia, which makes it almost impossible to simply equate it with adult relationships as a legitimate form of relationship. However, it cannot be denied that the utopia of all sexual happiness is sublated in the happy speechlessness in the face of one's own seduction, in the affirmation of one's own weakness not in the face of the feared strength, but the beloved weakness of the other. It is dreamed of in encounters with children who can do nothing about it and know nothing about it, because you don't have it yourself and will never find it with anyone who can even be considered as an equal partner, because what childhood promises without ever being it has long since died in you and in the world. Instead of arranging life in such a way that in the adult, who in the speechlessness and anesthesia of sexual love, which suspends the principle of individuation for moments, experiences the narrow-mindedness and narrowness of his seemingly self-determined self, childhood would finally not be extinguished but saved. Child protectors and anti-sexists do everything to ensure that the remnants of childhood experience are no longer only erased in adults, but in the children themselves. Childlike sexuality, which they want to drive out not only of the child but also of adult reflection by invoking the supposed innocence of the child, is its true innocence, the last remnant of primal regulated experience. Open to all the nuances of reality, of which the imagination is an essential part, approachable in the midst of the unapproachable, the truly individuated adult for a change, in whom childhood would be unfolded instead of dried up, could recognize in the universally invoked powerlessness and weakness of the child the promise of a world in which no one would have to be strong anymore because fear would be abolished in it. To make even small children strong against this hope and therefore blunt by asking them, as Ludwig Hirsch caricatures it in his song of the same name, to spit out a pacifier and throw away their storybooks in order to face a reality in which there is nothing but abuse, pornography and trauma, but also plenty of negotiating rules to avoid being seduced, that is the pedagogical mission of the child protectors. But it is precisely this mission that the Greens have always pursued. As certain as the communitarian efforts to liberate children's sexuality since the late 1960s were a response to the repressive educational methods of the no longer just bourgeois nuclear family that prevailed at the time, the nature of this response was already wrong at the time, and so similar was it to the pedagogical ideology in which the Green pedophile past is pilloried today. It is no coincidence that the Indian Commune, which called for the decriminalization of pedosexuality, saw itself as an association of children's rights activists, and it is no coincidence that Helmut Kentler, like the pedagogue Hartmut von Hentig, who himself was accused of pedophilia, was less influenced by Freudian sexual theory than by reform pedagogy. Communitarianism and reform pedagogy, alongside the sexual mysticism of the late Wilhelm Reich, the most important sources of the left-wing German variant of sexual revolution, never wanted to liberate sex, but always either mythicize or neutralize it. The refinement and eroticization of sexual self-expression through fashion, jewelry, indirect gestures, toleration and promotion of free intimacy is replaced by a desexualized, spiritualized nudity in reform pedagogical nudism, of which no one need actually be ashamed. Shame is an expression of civilized behavior and a necessary constituent of erotic tension, because it is neither shameful nor shameless, but thoroughly bashful. Instead of developing forms of intercourse that recognize and respect the child's sexuality as its own, which is impossible without tolerating privacy, communitarianism integrates the child into a supposedly free and equal, but therefore all the more unconscious community of friends under the spell of hierarchy, in which everyone is as fearless as they are powerless at each other's mercy, and from which the awareness of distance, a prerequisite of all humanity, is erased as reactionary. This hierarchy without hierarchy, which made the specific form of pedophilia possible in the first place, as it developed in Germany in the context of reform pedagogy and the communes, is closer to child protective and anti-sexist ethics in its resentment against any remembrance of child sexuality, which is always also a remembrance of the first nature in man, than its ideologues and the ex-communards themselves want to admit today. In this respect, the Greens have remained true to themselves in coming to terms with their entanglements. Perhaps the dangers of pedophilia will be eliminated once the child protectionists, with their free children's stores governed by touch and language rules and organized democratically by gender-conscious parents, have finally occupied the power of definition, but also because at some point there will simply no longer be any lovable children. Being lovable is as little a natural characteristic of children as it is of adolescents and adults. It is certainly not the result of a child's supposed naivety, which is usually just another word for their socially generated stupidity, for the mortified purity with which parents, who want to preserve the innocence of their offspring until they reach adulthood and protect them from all outside influences, tend to beat their children. What is described as seductive about the children in the given examples, no matter how strongly imaginatively transformed, is precisely not the mere childishness that distinguishes them from the adult, but the illumination of the adult in the child, just as anyone who is not completely struck dumb does not experience the stubborn adulthood of the adult, but the illumination of the child in the individuated person as seductive, charming, and lovable. Just as the most sublimated impulse of the mind still echoes the sensual impulse to which it owes itself, so the reason why adults love each other owes itself to the child's still unconscious, groping impulse with which it seeks, as it were, to touch the experience of which, fortunately, it will later be powerful. What is so negatively conspicuous to society in its underage children who are reviled as precocious, the gestures of smoothly wanting to please with which they seek to interest adults both intellectually and erotically, is nothing other than the late echo of the mimetic impulse with which the child seeks to resemble the world and the people it does not yet fully understand in order to understand more and better. To allow oneself to be seduced by the unknown, alien world and to seduce it oneself, to make it agreeable to oneself and to please it, is in this respect a prerequisite for all happy mediation, indeed for civilization itself. It is not for nothing that the principle of laissez-faire, laissez-aller, so despised in the economic sphere, has an erotic connotation that hardly anyone is aware of today, as an expression of the promise of happiness that the communicative traffic signs that people have erected in order to seal themselves off from one another and go at each other all the more uninhibitedly when freedom has become real, could one day become superfluous, because self-forgetfulness would then no longer mean powerlessness and self-empowerment would no longer mean self-coercion. The more aggressively people want to forget this promise, the more brutally they lash out at everything that still reminds them of it, even if only in their own imagination. The routine disparagement of Lolita, which was always perceived in its ambivalence, as both a threat and a promise of happiness, from the European fin de siècle to the 1960s, when the cultural figure of the child woman experienced a late flowering, first in US American and then in French popular culture, thus heralds a world in which no one can actually be seduced anymore and no one wants to be seduced anymore, because the hope of successful mediation has disappeared from it. Just because no one expects anything from anyone and nothing and still has to say yes to everything, as nothing other than the status quo even seems conceivable, it is so incredibly easy to respond to every challenge and every stimulus with the dull phrase no means no, which in reality is the mantra of unconditional affirmation. The word cuddle sex usually has a disrespectful undertone. It is assumed that those who practice such things live in panic fear of the aggressive elements of their own sexuality and seek a sense of security in infantile caresses that must always remain illusory. The sexually emancipated adult, on the other hand, knows that sex is about getting down to business and that cuddling comes afterwards at best. Tenderness is an abomination, especially to the left-wing everyday consciousness, unless it is one of the people's. Like bourgeois politeness, it is considered an adornment that should be avoided if you don't want to be declared a Philistine by your peer group. In times of organized antisociality, there would therefore be little objection to rehabilitating delicacy. But if you take a closer look at the allies for such a project, you will quickly lose the desire for caresses, the new Christian-based enthusiasm for cuddling that has spilled over from the United States to Germany in recent years, only to be distorted to the point of grotesque recognizability under the influence of the domestic popular mentality. Practices tenderness as a knockout strategy with which autistic monads prove their untouchability. The pioneers on the popular German cuddle front operate on two levels, as flexible guerrilla formations in the public sphere and as cadre groups behind closed doors. Based on the American model, the first variant is called free hugging, the second cuddle party. To the untrained eye, the representatives of the guerrilla faction may initially appear to be annoying PR goons who try to talk passersby in the shopping street into a trial subscription with a debonair grin. However, they can be recognized by their body shields bearing slogans such as "Touch me" or "Hugs allowed." In these times of bourgeois coldness, when hardly anyone is willing to let go and open up, the free huggers want to remind us how nice it can be to be fingered by strangers to our heart's content. The idea was conceived 5 years ago by Australian one man, who made his first attempts at public spontaneous hugs in Sydney, but was soon stopped by the police, a sure sign of their subversiveness. After several Australian, Canadian, and US cuddling attacks had been presented on YouTube and music groups such as the Sick Puppies had taken up the concept in their videos, grassroots pressure soon became so strong that the state had its back to the wall and had to back down. Since then, German comrades in arms have increasingly dared to offer themselves as living cuddly blankets to unsuspecting passersby, and several German cities hold an annual free hugging day, as graduate pedestrian zone huggers enthusiastically tell the evangelical magazine Chrisman, "I've never seen so many people laughing on the Zeal," and Frankfurt sociologist Tilman Allert is already predicting a loss of care triggered by hug inflation, which the power huggers have long since remedied. Meanwhile, similar to voluntary self-regulation, they have imposed strict rules on themselves. No free hugger is allowed to exchange names or addresses with their victims, and border crossings are punished with prompt denunciation. In this way, the happy message "we are all looking for love and don't have to hide from each other" is safeguarded against potential sex offenders with a general clause. Anyone who feels demonically turned on by the offer to cuddle would therefore have thoroughly misunderstood what the cuddle queen Mata Amritnandami, known as Amma, who has hugged 25 million people on her worldwide cuddle tours over the past 15 years and appears to be a veteran compared to Occidental cuddlers, formulates in the colors of Indian poetry. "From me flows an uninterrupted stream of love to all beings in this world. If you ask a river why it flows, what could it answer?" End quote. Amma, who is celebrated as a revolutionary in her home country because she subverts the contact rules of the Indian caste system, has already received the Gandhi King Prize for Nonviolence and the Interfaith Award for her human rights activism and is considered a heroine by German cuddle activists. No Western passionate hugger could explain more beautifully than her that free hugging is not about taking away the universal fear of touching individuals, but on the contrary about feeling connected to the whole world without ever offending a single one of its inhabitants. Picking up your quantum of caresses from the free hugger around the corner, just like getting your daily dose of sex from your partner, who has long since lost interest in anything else. This is the promise of happiness of the global buzz brigades, who exorcise sensuality in the name of human warmth. They are only surpassed by their comrades from the party front, who are organized in Germany on the website kuschelparty.com and openly express what Mama Amma lyrically embellishes. Quote, "Many singles don't have the feeling that they don't have enough sex, no. It's the cuddles that are missing, because this is clearly not about hitting on or getting hot. The participants should feel safe and secure." End quote. Because only those who have not been made hot but cold can feel safe, armpit sweat-free cuddling hosts now offer events for adults in dozens of German cities from Tuttlingen to Flensburg, where they can live out their need for touching and cuddling in a non-sexual atmosphere. Since neither awkward groping nor orgiastic exuberance, but rather protected cuddling alone promotes the immune system, German cuddle parties should, however, only be attended by healthy adults, as the self-imposed catalogue of laws of the Cuddling Association states, who should immediately call the Cuddle Guard, assigned for this purpose in the event of sexual harassment and are ready to bow to the orders of the cuddle leadership at any time. Even stoners and drinkers are not welcome, because only those who cuddle wide awake and aware are cuddling correctly. After all, you're not at the Dionysia, but rather in a dull rented apartment, and in such places the rule is, if the mood heats up too much, we interrupt. Instructed in this way, The German seeker of meaning in need of caressing can devote himself with full engagement to his cure, with the fruits of which he can make his fellow human beings happy the very next day as an honorary part-time cuddler. The only small drawback may be that participation in cuddling events is subject to a fee. But at least the touching is guaranteed to be free. The word relationship is the epitome of lovelessness. Contrary to what the left-wing everyday language suggests, in which relationship crises constantly have to be resolved or first and second relationships have to be coordinated, it is not a qualitative term, but rather the designation for an empty relationality. The fact that I have a relationship with everyone with whom I somehow enter into a relationship is unfortunately unavoidable and would not really be worth mentioning. If, despite this, the more narrow-minded and incapable of love people are, the more persistently they discuss their relationships, this is precisely because of its useful insignificance, according to the defenders of the term, who for their part live in open relationships. A word that can describe absolutely everything at least excludes nothing and is therefore more useful than exclusive titles such as love or friendship. In everyday life, however, this apparent openness is belied on a daily basis. Anyone who refers to someone as my relationship tends to disqualify the individual as the problem that the relationship can later be treated as and, if necessary, resolved. Calling the relationship to a person a relationship is the first step towards dealing with it. When it became the linguistic foam of left-wing everyday discourse, the word relationship had already had a career as the favorite vocabulary of the jargon of actuality. Wherever they encountered overly resistant contradictions in the course of their real dialogues, the existentialist adepts of the German Jewish philosopher of reconciliation Martin Buber invoked the I-thou relationship back in the 1920s, in which the dialogue partners always already i.e. beyond their empirical conversational situation stand. This you stand in the relationship, which was supposed to save the atrophied ego from final dissociation, was then diluted in left-wing speech to talk about all kinds of relationships that one leads instead of standing in, and none of which may become the relationship. Nevertheless, there is no contradiction between Buber's pathos of actuality and the inauthenticity of left-wing jargon. The substantiality of the relational word, which was already only invoked by Buber, has merely been completely emptied without the fetishism of the word being abandoned. On the contrary, the more evident it is that talking about relationships has no other function than to deceive the monads, who are completely absorbed in the web of constraints that constitute them, about their inability to have free object relations, the more obsessively the relationship is used against everything that is reminiscent of happiness and fulfillment, most aggressively against love, which becomes a love relationship, among emotional Stalinists, a romantic relationship. Individual love, which critics of monogamy see as a correlate of the property form because it entails jealousy, was in its origin the abolition of an immediate violent relationship, which is often confused with promiscuity, polygamy. Historically, polygamy is a variety of slavery that does without even the most rudimentary forms of mediation and in which sexuality is a pure, undisguised expression of domination. The bourgeois monogamy requirement aimed at overcoming the identity of sexuality and domination in the name of individual choice of love, which means the particular person, not his or her function in concubinage, servant group, or extended family. In jealousy, which arises as a complement to individual love, the fearful awareness of the transience and irreplaceability of the individual makes itself known for the first time in the history of feelings, an individual who was first established as an individual through the principle of comparison, without which there can be no concept of irreplaceability. For those who are incapable of jealousy, people are just as likely to melt into relationship material as they are to congeal into the death mask of obsessions for those obsessed with jealousy. At least as anachronistic as love and jealousy, which are only experienced as stubborn reflexes of an outdated form of consciousness, is another relationship of which there is no longer a living concept, the affair. Its petty bourgeois shrunken form is the fling, its postmodern one-night stand. Both words express in their discordance what they denote. The first the inconsequential and dreary attempt to break out of life's endless course, the second the senseless but arbitrary excess that does not free the mind but makes it heavy. The affair, however, was once the epitome of counter-love. Like the latter, it presupposes intimacy and attention. Like the former, it aims at the specifics of the individual, not at qualities that can be detached from him. Like love, the affair knows fidelity and commitment, and although it arises in the shadow of love, whose inadequacy it reminds us of, it does not betray it, but has a dignity equal to it. Affairs can last longer than love, and people who love each other happily can be as generous in their affairs as they are in love itself. The concept of the affair originates in the early history of diplomacy, where it denotes conflicts that are resolved secretly and without violence, but whose public expression could ignite barbarism, and migrates from there into the private sphere as a term for discreet indiscretion, the civilized transcendence of the constraints of civilization. The term relations also comes from diplomacy, although it does not refer to a delicate conflict, but to poor normality. And just as diplomacy has long since atrophied into a duplication of universal violence, relations only duplicate universal dullness. The fact that almost everyone now talks like the left in this area reveals their general function in the most personal sense: to be the avant-garde of the cheerful self-fragmentation of individuals who proudly credit themselves with the blind execution of their social destiny as progress in consciousness. There are two contrasting cinematic formats for the staging of people talking to each other and the forms of erotic relationship initiation linked to interhuman conversation. One originates from American cinema and was perfected by Woody Allen, the other from the French Nouvelle Vague. It can be found in the films of Eric Rohmer, which are often described as literary. Allen and Rohmer are similar in that they are considered intellectual filmmakers, not only because of the advanced aesthetic form of their works, but also because they mostly focus on intellectuals, artists, and writers. In both Rohmer's and Allen's films, amorous advances, infatuation, relationship quarrels, and their resolution take place in the mode of the spoken word. But while spoken language and libidinous communication are a constant problem for Allen's protagonists, a source of misunderstandings and weariness, for Rohmer's characters they form the law of motion of attraction, ensnarement, and seduction. With Allen, language, love, and sex get in each other's way. With Rohmer, they combine to form a living unity, even in amorous failure and grief. Perhaps this is why Allen's films, which are misleadingly referred to as relationship comedies, enjoy unbroken popularity with contemporary audiences, unlike Rohmer's films. Most people, especially if they belong to the same educational class as Allen's characters, can confirm from their own experience that when you try to fascinate the other person, you are in fact mostly talking to yourself, wanting to confirm yourself and discrediting yourself in the process, and that such misunderstandings harbor enormous comic potential. By laughing at Allen's films, they always laugh at the same time at their own false lives with all their amorous aberrations, without having to feel ashamed. The laughter remains a distanced, self-absorbed one. No one can really recognize themselves in Rohmer's talking lovers, because they manage the miracle from whose regular absence Allen's films derive their sarcasm. In Rohmer, love and language, spirit and eros, speech and seduction come together perhaps for the last time in the history of cinema. This is why Rohmer is more likely than Allen to develop a phenomenology of intellectual flirtation. Allen's intellectuals are likable, eloquent, and witty wafflers, but as wafflers they are always caricatures of intellectuality at the same time. Rohmer's characters, even if they are sometimes funny, are never ridiculous, but deeply serious. Just as Allen, after finding his genuine formal language for the depiction of erotic relationships with Annie Hall in 1977, differentiated it in constant repetition over the following decades, Rohmer's films since My Night at Maud's, 1969, have basically remained the same despite all the changes in nuance. They deepen rather than develop. But what would make a good joke in Allen's work is elevated by Rohmer to the main thing with a kind of Catholic pathos. Here, people flirt with each other genuinely and not ironically, by reading books together, by Pascal, Kierkegaard, Montaigne, by talking about theological proofs of God, the social philosophy of everyday life or films, by thinking, discussing, and arguing with and against each other. Never again have the argument, the linguistically communicated memory, and the reading aloud gain such immediate somatic, libidinous validity as in these films. They become corporealized, just as physical desire is given breath, a voice, and a face through them. A large part of Rohmer's films basically show nothing but speaking, listening, participating, responding faces. Nevertheless, these films are almost never about love as a pathos of substantiality, of the eternal and permanent, but as fleeting, approaching, and fading, as flirtation and seduction, which are the exact opposite of confession. Just as Rohmer, for the last time in the history of cinema, lent intellectual seriousness to the lightness of flirtation and a language to amorous rapprochement, Roland Barthes perhaps took the harmony of loving rapprochement and language at its word for the last time in 1977 in Fragments of a Language of Love. Contrary to what one would expect from a linguist and structuralist, and in marked contrast to Niklas Luhmann's 1982 study on love as passion, which was parched with communication and systems theory, Barthes is not interested in language as an arbitrary code or system of rules for the production or suggestion of love, but as a somatically mediated form of expression. In contrast to Rohmer, for whom dialogic language becomes a form of ensnaring and seduction, Barthes diagnoses that the discourse of love today is of extreme solitude. This discourse is probably, who knows, conducted by thousands of subjects, but defended by no one. It is completely abandoned by the adjacent languages, either ignored or devalued or even mocked. End of quote. Barthes counters this devaluation with an unqualified affirmation of the connection between love and language, in which he again resembles Rohmer, who shows the entry of both with seriousness and full affirmation as something increasingly fading. The connection between fleetingness and seriousness that Romer shows in intellectual flirtation was captured by Jean Baudrillard in his 1979 book On Seduction, with an indirect criticism of Barthes's idea that love today no longer has its own language. For Baudrillard, who opposes it with seduction, which follows rules instead of laws and is not deep but superficial, love is garrulous. Quote, compared to the crystal state of seduction, love is more of a liquid form, namely a gaseous solution. Everything can be dissolved in and through love. As the dissolution of all things in an enthusiastic harmony, love represents a kind of universal, unsurpassable answer. End quote. For Baudrillard, however, the seduction that he contrasts with love is no less serious than love, but in a different way. It follows the seriousness of the game, which is taken seriously and not lightly by those who really play it. Baudrillard's theory of seduction is thus at the same time an attempt to think flirtation, because just as with Romer's flirtation, Baudrillard's seduction does not do without language. It just does not speak the language of confession and profound self-analysis, but rather withdraws the words from the discourse of inwardness, authenticity and truth in order to make them. Baudrillard compares this process to fencing, the mode of a mutual approach, withdrawal and reapproach of the partners, who do not form a partnership, but are involved in an erotic duel. They have to abide by its rules, but they do not know the outcome. The idea that seduction and flirtation differ from love through a duel-like game of approach and withdrawal can be found long before Baudrillard in 1911 in the essay Coquetry, in George Simmel's Philosophical Culture. In it, Simmel distinguishes the fulfilled non-commitment and playful seriousness of flirtatious behavior as a substantial social surface phenomenon from the inwardness, exclusivity and profundity of love, which tends towards asociality. Unlike coquetry, the latter has no affinity to fashion as the incarnation of the surface in modernity. While, to close the circle, the surface in Woody Allen's relationship films is the preferred site of the ridiculous and comic misunderstanding, Romer elevates it to the sphere of erotic seriousness. For all the differences between these philosophers and aesthetes of intellectual flirtation, they are all similar in that they show it in its genuine places, in the big city, because it is urban and presupposes unpredictable fleetingness in the appearance, passing and disappearance of strangers. On vacation, especially in Romer's work. Because this temporarily suspends people from the constraints of everyday life and enables unexpected connections between strangers, and in linguistic exchange, which is a necessary law of movement for flirtation and not just its means. The latter insight into the phenomenology of flirtation in particular has often been formulated in France. The reasons for this have to do not least with the history of the French Republic, its central state organization and the linguistic history associated with it. Unlike in Germany, there was never a contrast between linguistic precision and linguistic illusion, between language as a form of expression of eros and logos, of thought and sensuality. The cliché of French as the language of love is a reminder of this connection. Nowadays, there is a consensus that sex can at best be talked about in a matter-of-fact or vulgar way. Its only manifestations in the medium of language are the anatomical report or the joke. Objectivity and vulgarity come together in pornography, which degrades the sensual body to a mere body and the happiness of the moment to a crude effect. Eroticism, on the other hand, is the counterpart of pornography, where the latter exposes everything, the former thrives on silence. Where the latter drags even the most intimate into the public eye, the latter lends the most general an aura of intimacy. For this very reason, however, language in the emphatic sense is always already a critique of pornography. If language wants to become pornographic, it must cross itself out, regress to the factuality of bodies, which can never be transformed into language without being transcended. Language itself is an articulation of sensuality. It can flatter or caress, attack or snub. It is a form of expression of the body. In May 1961, when the Italian poet Alberto Moravia, author of the novel Contempt, later made into a film by Jean-Luc Godard, was to interview the actress Claudia Cardinali, who had become famous for her role in Luchino Visconti's Rocco and His Brothers, for the magazine Esquire, Italian cinema was in the process of discovering the eros of language. In Michelangelo Antonioni's work, especially in his film The Night, which premiered in 1961, language is always both alienation and reconciliation, contact and obstacle. Nevertheless, the few moments in which his protagonists are close to each other are moments of language, not of silencing. The conversation that Moravia had with Cardinali, which is now available in an excellent translation, appears in retrospect as a commentary on Antonioni's cinema and an anticipated response to the well-known scene from Godard's film in which Michel Piccoli strokes Brigitte Bardot's naked body in order to enumerate which of her body parts he loves. But while Godard demonstrates how the body loses its magic by being transformed into language, Moravia transforms language into sensuality. The fact that language does not have to be an enemy of the body, but is capable of creating intimacy in the first place, is one of the most important motifs in Moravia's work. In the interview with Cardinali, this insight becomes the motif of the dialogue. Right at the beginning, Moravia rejects the voyeurism of the usual star interviews and explains that he is not interested in the opinions or experiences of his interviewee, but only wants to focus on her appearance. Quote, "I'm not interested in your views on politics, love, art, women and men, Italy, America, cinema, religion. Basically, I'm not interested in any of the things that seem to be essential interview material." End quote. The elements that, according to conventional wisdom, make up a person's character are in fact things in which you resemble millions of other people and which do not make you distinctive in any way. What is unmistakable is not the inside, but the surface. Quote, "Imagine if, instead of your physical description, your passport listed your preferences, your worldview, your past life and your future plans. Do you think that would make you recognizable? No, you would sink into anonymity." End quote. What people consider to be their own, their worldview, their experiences, their hopes, is in truth the most interchangeable thing. They are themselves in what they despise as outwardness, in their appearance. Moravia spends a lot of time having Cardinali describe her body or describing it herself. The hair, quote, "slightly wavy, so that it does not fall lifelessly on your shoulders and chest, but gives an impression of liveliness and movement, accompanying the curves of your body with its waves." End quote. The eyes, quote, "of a rather dark brown, but very bright and shining." End quote. The mouth, quote, "pouting, contemptuous, and above all a little coarse, boorish." End quote. The hands, quote, "hands of a boy or those of a thin, skinny woman." End quote. Although he does indeed question her almost in the manner of a passport inspector, Moravia does not take on the role of the male autocrat any more than Cardinali fulfills the cliché of the female echo. Rather, the two speak to each other to allow something to flash up that almost never arises in the interview genre, the harmony of intimacy and discretion. Moravia transforms the voyeurism of the star interview into an intimate communication that cannot even take place between lovers, but only between friendly strangers. She allows him to question Cardinali for almost half of the interview about how she goes to bed and gets up again. The disappearance at night and the appearance during the day are the two genuinely human actions. Quote, "Things can be seen during the day, they disappear at night. Day is therefore the time of objectivity, so full is it, indeed overflowing with visible things that impose their presence on us as it were. Night, on the other hand, is the time of subjectivity, black and without things, it is filled with our fantasies, our illusions, our errors, our dreams." End quote. But only man can feel the desire to disappear. Quote, "And he does this every evening by going to bed. He first disappears into the darkness of his room and then, as soon as he falls asleep, into the darkness of his consciousness." End quote. The clothes that people take off when they disappear into the night function as transitional objects into the world of daylight. Quote, "When you go to bed and fall asleep, you get rid of yourself, you gradually dissolve. When you wake up and get out of bed, you gradually put yourself back together again, you form yourself anew." End quote. It is no coincidence that the focus of the conversation is a story Cardinali tells about one of her dreams in which she falls out of a window and shatters on impact, which is not an unpleasant but a strange sensation. The body, seemingly identical to the individual person in everyday life, appears in dreams as something alien that the dreamer can observe like an independent object. The interlocutor is also able to recognize himself as such an object in dialogue, as Moravia understands it. It is precisely in the external that the unconscious reveals itself. Quote, "So you need have no fear that I could read your innermost being. What there is to read inside you is written on the person himself." End quote. This maxim is also followed by the volume of Conversations, which reveals the erotic substance of the language precisely because it maintains discretion. Anyone who closes it again, gripped and confused, is themselves transformed.